I am Lawrence, 70 years old, and currently standing in the ashes of the family I spent my entire life trying to build. I came home from my brother Edgar's funeral, my hands still shaking from the biting cold and the heavy grief. I held an envelope containing his last will and testament. He left me 2 massive farms and a beautiful log house on Lake Superior. I walked toward the kitchen, intending to share the news with my son Jordan and his wife Megan, hoping the inheritance would ease their hidden financial struggles. Instead, the voices bleeding through the cracked kitchen door stopped me dead in my tracks. What they said next turned my blood to absolute ice. They were actively plotting to declare me mentally incompetent, by the end of the month seize the Michigan properties and throw me into a state facility to clear a massive, undisclosed debt. Jordan agreed with a pathetic sigh of relief. My brother's final gift just became my death sentence. Before I share the details of this nightmare, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a betrayal from the very people you trusted with your life. The hallway floorboards creaked under my heavy leather boots, but the sound was completely swallowed by the sharp edge of Megan's voice. I stood frozen outside the kitchen, the manila envelope clutching the deeds to the Lake Superior land burning a hole against my palm. Megan paced the kitchen tiles. I could not see her face, but her tone carried the unmistakable weight of pure calculation. She laid out a timeline with terrifying precision. She demanded that Jordan call a specific psychiatrist she had already contacted to fast-track a dementia diagnosis. She insisted that my grief over Edgar provided the perfect cover for a rapid cognitive decline. Jordan offered a weak, trembling counter-argument. He muttered something about the cruelty of locking a sane man in a ward. Megan immediately weaponized their financial desperation. She reminded him of a shadow loan, a crushing debt hovering over their heads with a 30-day deadline. She stated clearly that the Michigan farms were the only liquid assets large enough to save them from total ruin. The silence that followed her ultimatum felt thicker than the winter air outside. Then I heard the sound that broke my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Jordan exhaled a long, heavy breath and agreed. He surrendered his father to a psychiatric prison to save his own skin. A weaker man would have kicked the door open. A more emotional father would have screamed, demanded answers, or wept at the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. I did none of those things. I spent 20 years working as a motor pool mechanic in the United States military. You learn very quickly in a combat zone that screaming does not stop an incoming threat. Survival requires absolute stillness and meticulous assessment. I took a slow, silent breath and slipped Edgar's will deep into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat. I pressed the fabric flat. I needed them to believe I was exactly what they were planning to label me: a weak, broken, and deteriorating old man. I intentionally slumped my shoulders, allowing the natural exhaustion of the funeral to hollow out my face. I dragged my right foot slightly across the floorboards to announce my presence, pushing the kitchen door open with a trembling hand. The conspiratorial whispers died instantly. The atmosphere in the kitchen snapped from frantic plotting to suffocating tension. Jordan stood by the sink, his knuckles white as he gripped the marble edge. He refused to meet my gaze, his eyes darting toward the floor like a coward caught in a lie. Megan, however, possessed a terrifying capacity for instant adaptation. Megan immediately smoothed her apron and rushed toward me with a perfectly manufactured look of profound sympathy. Her smile was a flawless mask of maternal care. She pulled out a dining chair and gently guided me into it, offering soft, condescending words about how exhausted I must look and feel. She moved to the stove and poured steaming water into a ceramic mug, claiming she had brewed a special herbal chamomile tea to help me sleep through the grief. She placed the dark, steaming liquid directly in front of me. She stood close, her hands resting on the back of my chair, ensuring I had no room to decline the offer. I picked up the mug. The warmth radiated through the ceramic, but as I brought it closer to my face, my military training kicked in. 20 years of stripping diesel engines, handling corrosive solvents, and repairing heavy machinery leaves a man with a highly sensitive olfactory radar. Beneath the pleasant, earthy aroma of the chamomile, I detected a faint, distinct, chalky scent. It was a sharp chemical undertone that did not belong in any natural tea. My mind raced, connecting the dots with ruthless clarity. Megan was not just planning to forge medical documents. She needed me to exhibit actual physical symptoms of cognitive decline. She needed me confused, lethargic, and disoriented when the doctors finally arrived to evaluate me. The tea was spiked with heavy sedatives. I kept my hands steady. I looked up at Megan, offering a weak, grateful smile that matched her own deceptive performance. I told her the tea was too hot to drink immediately. I claimed I needed to lie down in my own bed and that I would drink it there while reading my Bible. Jordan finally looked up, his face, a portrait of pathetic relief that I was removing myself from their presence. He mumbled a quick goodnight. I picked up the mug and shuffled slowly down the hallway, maintaining the fragile, defeated posture until my bedroom door clicked shut behind me. Once inside the privacy of my room, I dropped the act completely. My posture straightened. My hands stopped shaking. I walked over to the large potted fern sitting on my windowsill. I poured the entire contents of the spiked tea into the dark soil, watching the earth absorb the toxic concoction. I rinsed the mug in my adjoining bathroom, leaving just enough moisture at the bottom to make it look convincingly consumed. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark armchair in the corner of my room, staring at the closed door. I systematically reviewed every interaction I had with Jordan over the past year. I analyzed every request for money, every secretive phone call he took outside, and every time Megan looked at my property with hungry, calculating eyes. I had ignored the warning signs because a father desperately wants to believe the best about the son he raised. I had used my life insurance payout to secure the down payment on this very house for them, believing it was a foundation for their future. I now realized it was merely a down payment on my own destruction. The dawn broke gray and cold, casting long, sharp shadows across my bedroom floor. I stood up from the armchair, my joints stiff but my mind operating with crystal clear focus. I walked over to the windowsill to retrieve the empty mug. My eyes fell upon the potted fern. The sight sent a fresh, chilling wave of adrenaline straight through my veins. Just 24 hours ago, the plant had been vibrant green and full of life. Now the leaves were entirely blackened and curled inward. The stems drooped limply over the edge of the ceramic pot, effectively burned from the roots, up by whatever harsh chemical compound Megan had crushed into my tea. The sheer toxicity required to kill a healthy plant overnight was staggering. They were not just trying to make me sleepy, they were actively introducing heavy, dangerous narcotics into my system. If I had consumed that tea, my nervous system would have been utterly compromised. I would have woken up slurring my words, unable to balance, presenting the exact symptoms of a severe neurological collapse. Megan would have called the psychiatrist immediately, using my poisoned state as undeniable proof of my sudden dementia. I realized then the true scale of the battlefield. I was not dealing with a simple case of financial greed. I was dealing with a coordinated physical assault on my life and liberty. I pulled Edgar's will from my coat pocket and flattened it on my nightstand. The Lake Superior land was a multi-million-dollar prize, and my son was willing to step over my medicated body to claim it. I took a deep breath of the cold morning air filtering through the window crack. The grief for my brother and the heartbreak for my son instantly evaporated. Only the cold mechanical reality of survival remained. I needed to uncover the exact nature of their debt, find the invisible puppet master pulling Jordan's strings, and dismantle their entire operation piece by piece. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I waited by the front window, keeping my posture hunched and my breathing deliberately shallow. Jordan and Megan were preparing to leave for their Sunday brunch, a weekly ritual of overpriced mimosas and hollow socializing that they used to project an image of wealth they clearly did not possess. Megan adjusted the collar of her expensive designer coat, casting a fleeting, scrutinizing glance toward my bedroom door. I stood perfectly still behind the slight gap in the doorframe, letting the heavy shadows conceal my sharp, steady gaze. Jordan jingled his car keys in his pocket, his voice tight with an unspoken anxiety that I now recognized as the crushing weight of hidden, catastrophic debt. The front door clicked shut. The heavy brass deadbolt engaged with a solid thud. I watched through the wooden blinds as their sleek imported sedan backed out of the driveway and vanished down the quiet suburban street. The moment their vehicle turned the corner, the frail, deteriorating old man vanished completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders to release the manufactured tension I had been holding in my muscles. I moved swiftly and silently toward the garage. My extensive military service had ingrained a profound respect for standard operating procedures. You never enter a hostile zone without proper equipment. I opened my old olive-drab toolbox, a heavy steel relic from my days repairing armored transports under relentless, blistering desert heat. My calloused fingers moved with pure muscle memory, selecting a precise set of wire strippers, a thin tension wrench, and a specialized micro screwdriver. I walked upstairs toward Jordan's home office. The house was dead quiet, but the stagnant air felt charged with a volatile, dangerous static. I knew what I was about to do crossed a severe legal line, but morality had fundamentally left this house the moment my son allowed his wife to pour chemical poison into my tea. I placed my hand on the cold brass doorknob of Jordan's office. It was locked, secured by a standard pin tumbler mechanism that took me exactly 14 seconds to bypass with the tension wrench. I stepped inside the dimly lit room. Jordan had always been a man who aggressively craved the aesthetic of success without possessing the grueling work ethic required to sustain it. His office was a testament to that superficial ambition, featuring towering mahogany shelves lined with pristine, unread business books and a massive oak desk entirely free of actual paperwork. My target was hidden behind a large, framed abstract painting on the far wall. I removed the frame carefully, setting it down gently on the expensive Persian rug so it would not make a sound. Behind it sat a heavy-duty, flush-mounted steel wall safe. It utilized a modern biometric and digital keypad interface. Jordan likely believed this high-end technology made his secrets absolutely impenetrable. He vastly underestimated a man who had spent 2 decades diagnosing, dismantling, and hot-wiring encrypted ignition modules in military combat vehicles. I examined the digital keypad closely. The plastic casing around the numerical buttons showed slight repetitive wear. I used the micro screwdriver to gently pry the plastic faceplate away from the heavy steel door. A complex nest of red, blue, and green wires lay exposed in the dim light. I did not need to guess the entry code. I only needed to bypass the electronic locking relay. I stripped the protective rubber casing off the primary ignition wire and the grounding line. My hands were perfectly steady, unaffected by the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I tapped the exposed copper ends together. A sharp blue spark snapped in the shadows, followed instantly by the heavy, satisfying clack of the internal steel bolts disengaging. I pulled the heavy door open. The stale metallic scent of enclosed air hit my face, carrying with it the undeniable stench of financial ruin. The safe was not filled with stacks of cash or valuable stock certificates. It was stuffed to the brim with frantic, disorganized piles of paper. I pulled out the top folder and spread the documents across Jordan's immaculate oak desk. The bold, aggressive red ink of collection notices glared back at me. Jordan was completely drowning. He had accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in toxic commercial liabilities, masked entirely behind a failing, poorly managed shell company. I sifted through the frantic warnings from aggressive creditors, my heart sinking with every page. Then I found a thick, sealed manila envelope tucked at the very bottom of the safe. The printed label bore the exact address of the house I was currently standing inside. My stomach tightened into a painful knot. I bought this suburban home 12 years ago. I paid for it in full using the entirety of the life insurance payout after my wife passed away from a sudden illness. It was my solemn way of cementing a secure, debt-free future for our family. It was the only pristine, unencumbered asset I had left. To my name, a sacred monument to the brilliant woman who had loved me when I was just a grease-stained mechanic struggling to make ends meet. I tore open the envelope and pulled out a freshly notarized loan agreement. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for the sinister connection to Jordan's mounting panic. The central document was a commercial property lien. Jordan had maliciously put this entire house up as collateral for an exorbitant high-interest business loan. I flipped to the final signature page. My own name stared back at me, executed in a flawless, heavily practiced cursive. It was a masterful criminal forgery. Jordan had utilized a completely fabricated power of attorney to legally bind my private property to his own catastrophic failures. I felt a sudden violent surge of nausea, not from the impending loss of the physical house, but from the absolute moral bankruptcy of my only child. I traced the money trail detailed in the lending contract. The aggressive creditor was not a standard regulated bank. It was a shadow lending firm operating under a convoluted web of anonymous corporate entities. I scrutinized the corporate registry attached to the back of the contract. The parent company was officially registered to a man named Bradley, Megan's father. The picture snapped into brutal, terrifying focus. Bradley was a ruthless, predatory real estate developer who built his massive empire by aggressively exploiting vulnerable properties and crushing desperate families. This was never just about Jordan making a bad business investment. Bradley had intentionally funneled toxic loans to his own son-in-law, knowing with absolute certainty that Jordan would inevitably default. The contract contained a vicious acceleration clause. Bradley possessed the ironclad legal right to seize my home in exactly 30 days due to missed payments. Jordan and Megan were not simply greedy children. They were cornered rats fighting for survival. Megan's sudden, intense desire to lock me in a psychiatric ward was the final critical phase of her father's corporate theft. Once I was declared legally incompetent, Jordan would have unhindered, unchallenged authority to surrender the house to Bradley without a single legal fight. The poison tea was merely a blunt tool to execute a hostile takeover of my entire life. I carefully folded the forged documents, took high-resolution photographs of every single page with my phone, and placed everything exactly back into the safe. I meticulously rewired the keypad, closed the heavy steel door, and hung the abstract painting back on the wall. I walked out of the office and locked the door behind me. I realized my son was just a weak, easily manipulated pawn. The true enemy, the cold architect of my execution, was my own son's father-in-law. Bradley believed he could swallow my life whole and leave no trace behind. He was about to learn a devastating permanent lesson about what happens when you corner a veteran soldier who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The morning sun had barely crested the suburban skyline when the sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the manufactured peace of the house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of bitter black coffee, deliberately maintaining the heavy slump in my shoulders. Megan walked briskly down the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with an eager, frantic energy. She swung the heavy oak door open and ushered a man inside. He wore a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than a standard monthly mortgage payment, and he carried a thick premium leather clipboard. He did not carry a medical bag. He did not possess the gentle, worn demeanor of a healthcare professional. He had the cold, assessing eyes of a corporate shark swimming toward bleeding prey. Megan guided him into the living room and called my name with that sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone she exclusively reserved for her performances. She introduced the man as Dr. Eris. She confidently claimed he was a specialized grief counselor sent by a premium healthcare agency to help me process the sudden tragic loss of my brother. The man extended a meticulously manicured hand. I took it slowly, making absolutely sure my grip was weak, trembling, and uncertain. His skin was too smooth. A man who spends his life pulling desperate people out of emotional darkness carries physical tension in his hands. This man carried nothing but raw arrogance. They positioned me in the center of the plush living room sofa like a museum exhibit. Dr. Eris sat directly opposite me, uncaping an expensive gold fountain pen. Megan hovered nervously nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. The evaluation began immediately. The questions were deliberately condescending, designed to strip away my dignity. He asked me what year it was. He asked me to name the current president of the country. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I leaned heavily into my decades of military survival training. In a hostile interrogation, your absolute greatest weapon is your captor's profound underestimation of your intelligence. I gave them exactly what they desperately needed to see. I stared blankly at the floral wallpaper behind his head. I slurred my words, slightly dropping my jaw to mimic a severe loss of facial motor control. I provided the wrong year with utter conviction. I confused the name of the current president with a man who had served 2 decades ago. When he asked me to count backwards, I stumbled after 3 numbers and feigned a mild, confused panic. Megan let out a loud, theatrical sigh of deep sorrow. She placed a comforting hand on the doctor's shoulder, silently reinforcing the tragic narrative of my rapid cognitive decline. I watched her flawless performance from behind the veil of my simulated dementia. She was a phenomenal actress, but her blinding greed made her sloppy. The interrogation dragged on for 20 grueling minutes. Eris jotted down furious notes on his leather clipboard, expertly keeping the pages angled away from my line of sight. Suddenly, his phone buzzed violently in his breast pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He looked up at Megan and gave a sharp, urgent nod. Megan immediately suggested they step out onto the back patio to discuss my preliminary treatment plan so as not to distress me further. They stood up in unison and walked quickly toward the glass sliding doors. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them. They were standing near the edge of the brick patio, their voices entirely muffled by the thick double-pane glass. The frail, broken old man vanished the instant their backs were turned. I moved with the silent, fluid speed of a man half my age. I crossed the living room rug and reached the coffee table where Eris had foolishly abandoned his clipboard. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened a hidden document scanner app I had installed the night before. I flipped the heavy leather cover back. My eyes scanned the dense, aggressive legal typography. This was not a psychological evaluation. It was not a medical intake form. The bold corporate letterhead at the top of the page belonged to Apex Holdings, the exact same shadow real estate firm owned by Bradley. I snapped high-resolution photographs of every single page, my hands moving with mechanical precision. The documents were comprehensive property appraisal forms and a full unconditional waiver of estate rights. They were meticulously pricing the square footage of my current home, calculating the absolute maximum liquidation value down to the final cent. Below the appraisal summary was a stark legal surrender document. It stated clearly that the undersigned willingly transferred all asset management authority directly to Jordan due to severe mental incapacitation. Staring at those aggressive corporate margins, a bitter memory flared vividly in my mind. Edgar and I grew up in the crushing, suffocating poverty of 1960s Detroit. We spent our childhoods watching ruthless landlords and predatory bank agents hand out eviction notices, throwing our hardworking neighbors onto the freezing sidewalks over mere pennies. Edgar and I had stood in the freezing rain one winter, watching our own mother cry uncontrollably over a foreclosure notice. We swore a blood oath that day. We promised each other that we would work until our hands bled, that we would own our land outright, and that no greedy corporate suit would ever strip us of our rightful ownership. Edgar had kept that promise until his dying breath. I was not about to break it now. I flipped to the final page of the packet and snapped the last photograph. I placed the cover perfectly back into its original position, ensuring the gold fountain pen rested at the exact angle Eris had left it. I retreated silently to the sofa and immediately resumed my slumped, vacant posture. A few seconds later, the glass door slid open. A blast of cold air entered the room, followed by Megan and the counterfeit doctor. Aris walked back to the coffee table and picked up his clipboard. His demeanor was noticeably more aggressive now. The polite bedside manner had completely evaporated. He turned to me and stated that my cognitive state required immediate legal protection to ensure my future medical bills could be paid. He flipped the clipboard to the final page containing the waiver of estate rights and placed it forcefully on my lap. He handed me his heavy fountain pen. He told me it was just a standard treatment consent form to allow Megan and Jordan to pick up my daily prescriptions. Megan leaned in close, her cheap floral perfume failing to mask the stench of her betrayal. She spoke to me as if I were a toddler, coaxing me to sign the paper so I could finally get some rest. I looked at the pen. I looked at the dotted line. If I refused to sign, they would know I was lucid. They would instantly pivot to a more violent, forceful method of extraction. I had to feed their arrogance to maintain my crucial tactical advantage. I reached out and took the pen. I did not use my dominant right hand. I transferred the heavy brass pen into my left hand. I gripped it awkwardly, letting my knuckles shake with tremendous effort. I pressed the metal nib against the expensive paper and dragged the ink across the dotted line. I created a jagged, illegible, and wildly inaccurate series of loops and scribbles. It looked exactly like the desperate, failing attempt of a man whose brain was melting into nothingness. It was a completely useless, legally invalid signature. Eris snatched the clipboard away the moment I finished the final messy loop. He inspected the signature, exchanging a victorious, triumphant look with Megan. They honestly believed they had just conquered my entire life with a single stroke of a pen. Eris packed his briefcase, offered a hollow apology for my deteriorating condition, and swiftly exited the front door. Megan practically skipped into the kitchen to call her father and report their absolute success. I sat alone in the living room, listening to her muffled voice echoing down the hallway. I knew exactly what that counterfeit appraisal meant. Bradley was not waiting for the standard 30-day foreclosure window on the shadow loan. The timeline had drastically accelerated. By forging this medical waiver, Bradley intended to seize the house and liquidate my assets before the end of the week. The foreclosure clock was ticking dangerously fast. The trap was closing around me, but they were entirely unaware that I was the one holding the mechanism. I needed to build my legal shield immediately, and I could not afford a single misstep. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across my bedspread. Megan had intensified her surveillance. She hovered near my bedroom door, pretending to dust the hallway table, her eyes darting toward my every movement. I knew she was waiting for the sedatives to completely dissolve my cognitive functions. If I simply walked out the front door, she would intercept me, claim I was wandering, and use it as immediate justification for the psychiatric hold. I needed a completely unassailable reason to leave the house, one that forced her to play the role of the devoted caregiver in public. I sat on the edge of the bed and initiated a severe, physically taxing performance. Using techniques learned during altitude training in the military, I restricted my airflow and forced a harsh, rattling cough from deep within my chest. I strained my vocal cords, making the sound wet, desperate, and alarming. I gripped my chest, leaning heavily against the doorframe as I stumbled into the hallway. Megan dropped her dusting cloth. Her initial look of annoyance quickly shifted into a mask of maternal concern as she rushed forward. I gasped for air, demanding to be taken to a specific urgent care clinic 3 miles away, claiming my regular doctor worked a morning shift there. She tried to suggest calling a different doctor to the house, but I amplified the coughing fit until my face turned a concerning shade of gray. Fear of a sudden medical emergency that could derail her father's meticulously timed foreclosure forced her hand. She grabbed her keys and guided me to the car. The clinic waiting room was crowded, smelling of sterile alcohol and stale coffee. Megan guided me to a plastic chair, loudly explaining my fabricated symptoms to the receptionist to ensure everyone witnessed her profound dedication. When the nurse finally called my name, Megan attempted to follow me into the examination hallway. I turned and offered a weak, embarrassed smile, whispering that I needed to discuss a private, highly sensitive issue with the physician. The nurse, strictly adhering to patient privacy protocols, firmly asked Megan to remain in the lobby. The heavy wooden door clicked shut instantly, severing her line of sight. My fragile demeanor vanished the second I stepped into the sterile corridor. I did not enter the examination room. I walked briskly past the supply closets, my eyes scanning the ceiling for security cameras. I navigated the familiar layout of the building with absolute precision. I pushed through the restricted staff double doors, bypassed the break room, and reached the heavy metal delivery exit at the rear of the clinic. I pushed the emergency bar, slipped out into the cold morning air, and let the steel door latch securely behind me. I pulled the collar of my wool coat up against the wind and walked 2 blocks down the alleyway to a discreet, unmarked brick building. I pressed the intercom buzzer next to a heavy mahogany door. A sharp mechanical click granted me access to the private law office of Evelyn. I stepped into a room lined with dense legal volumes and stark modern furniture. Evelyn sat behind a massive glass desk. She was a formidable African-American woman in her late 40s, possessing a brilliant, unyielding legal mind that terrified local prosecutors and corporate attorneys alike. She looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes scanning my face. She did not offer empty platitudes or waste time with small talk. She immediately poured 2 cups of black coffee and gestured toward the leather chair opposite her. Evelyn and I shared a bond that transcended standard legal representation. Her father had served in the exact same infantry unit as I did during a brutal overseas deployment. He was a good man, but he found himself facing an unjust, racially motivated court-martial orchestrated by a corrupt commanding officer seeking a convenient scapegoat. The charges would have resulted in dishonorable discharge and years in a federal military prison. I stepped in, leveraging my own unblemished record and risking my rank to secure the classified motor pool logs that completely exonerated him. I provided the irrefutable evidence that shattered the commander's false narrative. Evelyn grew up knowing that my intervention was the sole reason her family survived intact. She owed me a lifelong debt of absolute loyalty, and she was fiercely committed to my cause. I sat down and placed my smartphone on the glass surface of her desk. I opened the encrypted folder containing the high-resolution photographs I had taken inside Jordan's home office and the counterfeit appraiser's clipboard. I laid out the entire situation with absolute, unflinching military precision. I detailed the forged power of attorney, the toxic commercial loan Jordan had secured against my property, and the rapidly accelerating foreclosure timeline engineered by Bradley. I explained the sedatives hidden in my tea and the impending psychiatric hold Megan was orchestrating to secure total control over my physical autonomy. Evelyn listened without interrupting her expression, growing colder and more intensely focused with every sentence. Her fingers flew across her mechanical keyboard, cross-referencing the corporate registry documents and shadow lending shell companies I had photographed. She pulled up the county property records and analyzed the digital footprints of Bradley's real estate empire. The silence in the office grew heavy as her monitors reflected the stark, terrifying reality of the legal battlefield. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her jaw set in a tight, uncompromising line. She turned her monitor toward me, pointing to a specific series of legal filings hidden deep within the county database. She had uncovered a terrifying truth that completely altered our tactical approach. The foreclosure process was not following standard legal protocols. Bradley had not just filed the paperwork, he had specifically routed the eviction proceedings through a corrupt local judge whom he had heavily bribed through offshore campaign contributions. This judge had a notorious reputation for rubber-stamping Bradley's corporate acquisitions and burying opposing counsel in endless suffocating red tape. Evelyn looked me dead in the eye and delivered the crushing reality. A standard civil defense, even with the undeniable proof of Jordan's forgery, would take months to litigate in a compromised courtroom. Bradley's bribed judge had already approved an expedited eviction order. I was going to be physically removed from my home by armed sheriffs in exactly 14 days. We could not fight this battle in a local court where the enemy owned the referee. We needed a weapon massive enough to bypass the local corruption entirely. We needed a strategy devastating enough to absolutely annihilate Bradley's entire corporate firm from the top down. Evelyn sat back, the stark glow of the monitor reflecting in her dark, calculating eyes. 14 days. That was the absolute limit of my suburban existence before armed county deputies would arrive to drag me onto the pavement. I did not blink. I did not allow a single muscle in my face to betray any sense of panic. Panic is a useless luxury for those who do not have a tactical contingency plan. I reached into the deep concealed inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and extracted the thick manila envelope I had carried since the funeral. I placed it on the pristine glass desk, sliding it smoothly across the polished surface until it rested inches from her mechanical keyboard. I told her that a conventional defense in a compromised, bribed local court was a complete waste of our strategic resources. I explained that if Bradley wanted to play a high-stakes game of aggressive asset seizure, we needed to immediately shift our focus to the assets that actually mattered. Evelyn slowly opened the envelope with careful surgical precision. She carefully unfolded my brother Edgar's last will and testament, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. I explained the contents in a steady, measured voice, ensuring every detail was perfectly clear. Edgar had left me 2 sprawling agricultural farms and a massive custom-built log house sitting directly on the rugged, freezing coastline of Lake Superior. It was a vast expanse of pristine, untouched wilderness located deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Evelyn scrutinized the legal boundaries, the specific plot dimensions, and the precise geographical coordinates listed on the property deeds. Her sharp, unyielding legal mind immediately recognized that we needed to understand the exact quantifiable monetary value of the board we were currently playing on. She pulled up a highly specialized federal environmental database, a secure government portal her firm utilized exclusively to evaluate complex, multi-layered corporate litigation cases. She began typing with a ferocious, relentless rhythm, the digital maps of northern Michigan rendered quickly on her massive dual monitors. She expertly overlaid topographical grids, historical state property lines, and finally restricted deep geological survey scans. The computer screen suddenly lit up with a brilliant, vibrant array of deep blue thermal indicators directly beneath the green topography of Edgar's inherited farms. Evelyn leaned closer to the high-resolution screen, her eyes narrowing sharply as she interpreted the dense, complex geological data flowing across the monitor. She looked at me with a profound, almost terrifying clarity. The 2 isolated farms and the rustic log house did not merely sit on valuable, scenic coastal real estate. They sat directly on top of a massive, previously unexploited natural freshwater aquifer. It was a subterranean reserve of pristine, completely purified drinking water, so incredibly large it could comfortably supply a major metropolitan city for decades without ever running dry. The standard market value of the surface land was completely irrelevant compared to this monumental discovery. The true astronomical treasure was buried deep beneath the thick limestone bedrock. Looking at the glowing blue thermal map, a heavy, deeply painful memory surfaced in my mind. Edgar had spent the last 10 grueling years of his life locked in a vicious, exhausting war against aggressive corporate developers. They had constantly circled his Michigan property like starving vultures, offering him insulting sums of fast cash, desperately trying to legally bully him into surrendering his exclusive water rights so they could drain the lake and the underground reserves for commercial bottling and global export. Edgar had fiercely fought them in crowded town halls and corrupt local courts and standing stubbornly on his own wooden front porch. He had sworn to me, looking me dead in the eye, that he would rather burn the pristine farms to absolute ash then let greedy corporate leeches drain the lifeblood of his land. My brother had died defending that water from corporate predators. Now his final unfinished battle had fallen directly into my calloused hands. I fully intended to honor his lifelong sacrifice with the absolute uncompromising destruction of anyone who dared to step foot on his property. Evelyn did not hesitate. She immediately cross-referenced the newly discovered aquifer data with the obscure shadow lending firm that currently held the fraudulent forged mortgage on my suburban house. She ran a complex multi-tiered financial algorithm searching for hidden corporate shell companies, limited liability partnerships, and offshore bank accounts tied directly to Bradley's sprawling real estate empire. The digital financial trail was deliberately convoluted, expertly designed by high-priced corporate lawyers to intentionally hide the true architect of the scheme behind impenetrable layers of corporate bureaucracy. But Evelyn was an absolute master at dismantling corrupt financial labyrinths. She tracked a highly suspicious series of massive, exorbitant, high-interest loans originating directly from Bradley's primary holding company, filtering quietly down through the aggressive shadow lender and landing squarely on Jordan's failing, desperate business accounts. She pulled up the official transaction ledgers and cross-referenced the exact dates of the financial transfers. The timing of the loans was entirely too perfect to be a simple coincidence. The digital banking records proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bradley had initiated the toxic loan protocol with Jordan exactly 48 hours after Edgar received his terminal medical diagnosis from the local oncology department. Bradley had been meticulously monitoring Edgar's rapidly declining health status. The terrifying cold-blooded reality of the situation crystallized perfectly in the quiet, secure law office. Bradley already knew about the massive subterranean water reserves. He absolutely possessed the exact same deep geological surveys that Evelyn had just uncovered on her glowing monitors. He absolutely did not care about acquiring my modest suburban house in the slightest. My family home was merely a convenient, highly leveraged financial hostage in a much larger game. Bradley had intentionally pushed Jordan into a catastrophic, inescapable loan agreement specifically to force our entire family into a sudden crushing and completely irreversible bankruptcy. He knew Jordan lacked the discipline and business acumen to repay the debt. He knew Jordan would eventually panic and forge the power of attorney to save himself. He knew Jordan would inevitably default on the impossible repayment terms. Bradley's ultimate sinister goal was to use the immense, suffocating financial debt to legally compel Jordan to liquidate all newly inherited assets to cover the massive financial shortfall. He was meticulously orchestrating a flawless legal scenario where he could systematically seize the Lake Superior aquifer for absolute pennies on the dollar during a forced, rapid bankruptcy auction. It was not a simple act of pathetic domestic betrayal by a desperate son. It was a highly premeditated multi-million-dollar corporate theft, flawlessly disguised as a tragic family financial collapse. I looked at the impending eviction notice displayed on the left screen, then at the glowing topographical map of my brother's sacred land on the right. Bradley truly thought he had successfully cornered a fragile, helpless, deteriorating old man. He did not realize he had just unknowingly handed a veteran combat mechanic the exact devastating weapon required to tear his entire corrupt empire straight to the ground. The harsh, fluorescent lights of Evelyn's office buzzed with a low mechanical hum, underscoring the gravity of our newly discovered reality. Fighting Bradley in a conventional civil courtroom was a tactical impossibility. He possessed unlimited corporate resources, a battalion of highly paid litigators, and a local judge securely residing in his deep pockets. If I attempted to file injunctions or contest the forged power of attorney through standard legal channels, Bradley would bleed me dry with procedural delays until the expedited eviction order was fully executed. I was a retired mechanic, not a billionaire. I could not outspend him, and I could not outmaneuver a bribed judicial system. I looked across the heavy glass desk at Evelyn. I told her we needed to fundamentally change the rules of engagement. If Bradley's entire strategy relied on seizing a highly lucrative physical asset, the only guaranteed method of defeating him was to ensure the asset ceased to hold any financial value whatsoever. We had to completely remove the prize from the board. Evelyn's dark eyes locked onto mine, silently calculating the profound magnitude of what I was suggesting. She understood my unspoken directive immediately. We were going to burn the ships. Evelyn turned back to her massive dual monitors and began typing with a ferocious, relentless intensity. She bypassed standard state property transfers and accessed the highly secure federal environmental protection portals. She explained the precise legal mechanics as her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. We were going to draft an ironclad, irrevocable federal conservation trust. This specific legal instrument was designed by the government to permanently shield ecologically critical habitats from aggressive corporate exploitation. By transferring the deed of Edgar's Lake Superior Farms directly into this federal trust, the land would instantly become protected national territory. It could never be sold, commercialized, drained, or developed by any private entity. Not by Bradley, not by Jordan, not even by me. I would permanently forfeit all financial rights to the property. The millions of dollars hidden within that pristine subterranean aquifer would be locked away beneath the freezing Michigan bedrock until the end of time. Evelyn printed the dense legal packet and placed it on the glass desk between us. She warned me that this action was absolute and completely irreversible. Once the ink dried and the federal digital seal was applied, the immense generational wealth my brother had fiercely defended would evaporate into a purely philanthropic legacy. There would be no secret payouts and no hidden royalties. I stared at the thick stack of legal documents, tracing the sharp, aggressive black typography with my tired eyes. My mind drifted away from the sterile law office and slipped back into the distant, fading memories of Jordan's childhood. I remembered the crushing, suffocating poverty of 1960s Detroit that Edgar and I had barely survived. I remembered the exact smell of industrial grease and cheap chemical soap that clung to my skin after working grueling 14-hour shifts at the military motor pool. I had broken my back, shattered my knuckles, and swallowed my pride every single day to ensure my son never had to know the bitter, suffocating taste of being poor. I had deliberately shielded him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. I provided him with a comfortable suburban life premium sporting equipment and a fully funded college education. I bought him his first vehicle and financed his lavish wedding to Megan. In my desperate, blind desire to give him everything I never had, I had completely failed to teach him the fundamental value of hard work. I had raised a boy who expected the world to hand him massive success on a silver platter. He had grown into a fragile, arrogant man who deeply craved the unearned luxury of Bradley's toxic corporate lifestyle. My profound failure as a father was the exact vulnerability Bradley had expertly exploited to turn my own son into a desperate criminal. I picked up the heavy brass pen resting beside the documents. I knew losing the monumental financial value of this pristine land was a devastating sacrifice. It was a fortune that could have easily secured my bloodline for a dozen generations. But as I looked at the signature line, a cold, unyielding clarity washed over my conscience. Stripping away the monetary value of this inheritance was the only remaining method to save my son's corrupted soul. If I allowed the wealth to exist, the sheer magnitude of the money would completely consume him. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a steady, unflinching hand. I executed the transfer with absolute military precision, permanently locking the Lake Superior Farms away from human greed. Evelyn immediately fed the signed pages through her high-speed digital scanner, transmitting the encrypted files directly to the Federal Conservation Authority in Washington. The digital confirmation receipt flashed across her monitor with a bright green notification. The land was officially untouchable. The legal shield was perfectly forged. Now I needed to weaponize the illusion of the prize to draw the enemy entirely out into the open. I requested a physical photocopy of Edgar's original unaltered last will and testament. I folded the crisp pages carefully and placed them inside the inner pocket of my coat. I thanked Evelyn for her flawless execution, pulled my collar up against the biting wind, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. The return trip to the suburban house felt like walking straight into the jaws of a predator. I utilized the spare key hidden beneath the porch planter, slipping inside the front door with practiced, absolute silence. Megan was upstairs, the faint hum of a television masking my arrival. I maintained the stoic, hollow posture of a heavily medicated man as I shuffled slowly down the hallway to my bedroom. I closed the door silently and approached my dark oak dresser. I pulled the photocopy of Edgar's original will from my pocket. I did not hide it. I intentionally unfolded the document and placed it squarely in the center of the wooden surface, ensuring the bold legal text detailing the massive Michigan acreage was perfectly illuminated by the afternoon sun. I placed my brass reading glasses directly on top of the paper, framing the bait with meticulous, calculated intent. I retreated to the heavy armchair in the corner of the room, sinking deeply into the shadows. I waited with the absolute stillness of a sniper in a blind. The heavy silence of the house stretched for over an hour before the predictable sound of footsteps approached my door. Jordan pushed the door open without knocking, a blatant display of his deeply eroded respect. He stepped into the room holding a glass of tap water, likely intending to check if the morning sedatives were still holding my mind hostage. His eyes immediately locked onto the stark white paper resting on the dark oak dresser. He froze in his tracks. He placed the glass slowly on the nightstand and stepped closer to the document. I watched from the shadows as his eyes darted rapidly across the legal descriptions, tracing the sheer staggering magnitude of the Lake Superior estate. I could physically see the exact moment the desperate panic of a cornered debtor mutated into the blinding, intoxicating euphoria of a millionaire heir. The crushing weight of Bradley's shadow loan suddenly evaporated from his physical posture. He was no longer a terrified pawn facing federal prison. He believed he was standing over a golden ticket. He snatched the paper from the dresser, his hands trembling with a sudden vicious surge of raw greed. He turned and walked quickly out of the room, completely ignoring my silent presence in the corner. His fear of his ruthless father-in-law had been entirely eclipsed by the intoxicating promise of unearned millions. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the vultures were about to descend. The suffocating tension in the suburban house vanished the very next morning, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured warmth. Jordan and Megan abruptly canceled their aggressive push for my immediate psychiatric evaluation. The rushed eviction plans were instantly shelved. Instead, the house filled with the smell of roasting garlic and expensive wine. Megan knocked gently on my bedroom door, her voice dripping with a newfound artificial reverence. She announced that we were hosting a special family dinner that evening to celebrate my brother Edgar's life and my unexpected inheritance. She casually mentioned that her father Bradley would be joining us to offer his condolences. I knew exactly what this sudden pivot meant. The predators had caught the scent of fresh blood. They believed I was sitting on an unexploited gold mine, and they needed to keep me comfortable just long enough to steal it. I did not object. I offered a vacant, grateful nod and slowly closed the door. The moment the latch clicked, my fragile persona dropped. I moved to my tactical duffel bag hidden beneath the bed frame. I retrieved a digital micro-recorder, a small matte black device I had purchased specifically for this phase of the operation. I tested the battery and the omnidirectional microphone. I slipped into the dining room while Megan was completely absorbed in the kitchen and Jordan was upstairs showering. I knelt on the hardwood floor and used a strip of heavy-duty adhesive to secure the recorder directly beneath the center of the solid oak dining table. I pressed the record button, ensured the red indicator light was completely masked by the wood grain, and retreated to my room. Bradley arrived exactly at 7 o'clock. His heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer, carrying the undeniable weight of unearned arrogance. He walked into the dining room wearing a tailored charcoal suit projecting the aura of a benevolent patriarch. He extended a firm hand toward me, offering a polished, practiced monologue about how deeply sorry he was for my loss. I took his hand with a weak, trembling grip, dropping my gaze to the floor. I let my shoulders sag, portraying a grieving, confused old man completely overwhelmed by the complexities of life. Bradley bought the performance instantly. His eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction as we sat down to eat. Throughout the meal, Megan and Jordan showered me with exaggerated affection, constantly refilling my water glass and cutting my food into smaller pieces. Bradley steered the conversation with the subtle, calculated precision of a seasoned corporate shark. He brought up Edgar's will, framing his inquiries as deep concern for my financial well-being. He leaned across the table, his voice thick with false empathy. He warned me that managing a massive, undeveloped estate like the Lake Superior Farms would invite crushing, insurmountable government taxes. He painted a terrifying picture of federal auditors and crippling maintenance fees. Then he offered his salvation. He gently suggested that his massive real estate firm could manage the land on my behalf, shielding me from the financial burden so I could simply rest and grieve in peace. He promised to handle all the complicated legal paperwork, asking only for my signature to initiate the protective transfer. I stared blankly at my plate, nodding slowly as if I barely understood his complex financial vocabulary. Internally, a cold, familiar anger hardened my resolve. I had sat across from Bradley once before, exactly 5 years ago at Jordan and Megan's wedding reception. That night, Bradley had consumed 3 glasses of expensive scotch before cornering me near the open bar. He had looked at my rented tuxedo and my calloused hands with thinly veiled disgust. He had openly mocked my 20 years as a military mechanic, loudly wondering how a man who spent his life covered in dark grease could afford to send a son to a premium private university. He had peppered his insults with sharp, calculated racial microaggressions, implying that my presence in his wealthy social circle was a bizarre, unnatural anomaly. I had swallowed the bitter humiliation that night to protect my son's happiness, gripping my glass until my knuckles turned white, refusing to cause a scene. Bradley had looked at me then, just as he looked at me now, seeing nothing but a stepping stone, a lesser human being, entirely unworthy of respect. He believed my blue-collar background made me inherently stupid. He was absolutely convinced that a black veteran from the motor pool could not possibly comprehend the sophisticated mechanics of high-level corporate theft. I used his blinding prejudice against him. I offered a frail, bewildered thank you across the dining table, telling him I was so relieved to have a smart businessman looking out for my best interests. The dinner eventually concluded with hollow toasts and fake smiles. I excused myself early, citing a sudden heavy wave of exhaustion. Megan quickly assisted me down the hallway, eager to remove the senile old man from the adult conversation. I closed my bedroom door, lay on my bed in the dark, and waited. 2 hours passed before the front door finally slammed shut, signaling Bradley's departure. I waited another 30 minutes until the house fell into absolute heavy silence. I slipped out of my room, navigating the dark hallway with perfect memory. I crawled beneath the dining table, retrieved the micro-recorder, and returned to my sanctuary. I plugged my earpiece into the device and hit play. The audio captured the initial dinner conversation with perfect clarity, but I fast-forwarded to the moments immediately after I had left the room. The transition in the recording was violent. The false warmth vanished, replaced by the harsh, echoing acoustics of the kitchen. I heard the sharp, sudden sound of a glass shattering against the tile floor. Bradley had completely dropped his benevolent facade. His voice was a low, venomous growl as he physically backed Jordan against the kitchen counters. I heard Bradley grab my son by the collar of his shirt. Bradley did not ask for the Lake Superior land. He demanded it. He laid out the grim, inescapable reality of Jordan's situation. Bradley explicitly instructed Jordan to use the forged power of attorney to execute an immediate, unconditional transfer of the Michigan farms directly into Bradley's primary corporate holding company. He demanded the paperwork be finalized and filed by the end of the week. Jordan's voice trembled on the recording as he begged for more time, frantically arguing that moving such a massive asset so quickly would undoubtedly raise red flags with state auditors. Bradley's response was a masterclass in ruthless extortion. He reminded Jordan about the toxic shadow loans and the fabricated collateral. Bradley delivered his ultimate devastating ultimatum. He stated clearly that if Jordan refused to execute the transfer immediately, Bradley would personally walk the forged loan documents into the local federal bureau. He promised to hand the police the undeniable proof of Jordan's financial fraud, guaranteeing my son a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The recording captured the heavy, suffocating silence of a man realizing his life was entirely forfeit. Jordan's breathing grew ragged and shallow. He had no escape route. The extortion was absolute. A few seconds later, I heard the final damning words spoken by my only child. Jordan quietly agreed to the cruel terms. He promised to betray his father, forge the deeds, and hand over the multi-million-dollar estate to save himself from federal prison. I pulled the earpiece out, sitting in the dark room as the cold reality settled over me. The battle lines were permanently drawn. The morning sunlight hit the frosted glass of my bedroom window, casting cold, fragmented beams across the floorboards. I sat perfectly still in the heavy armchair, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and gray trousers, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The house was suffused with a manic, nervous energy. I could hear the rapid, heavy thud of Jordan's footsteps pacing the hallway outside my door. He was entirely running out of time. Bradley had given him a strict, unforgiving deadline to surrender the Michigan estate, and the crushing weight of that corporate extortion was driving my son into a state of blind, reckless desperation. I took a deep breath, deliberately centering my mind. The military taught me long ago that the most dangerous moment of any combat ambush is the final silent second before the trigger is pulled. You must completely empty your heart of all lingering emotion. You must become a pure, calculating instrument of execution. A sharp knock struck the wooden door panel. Jordan did not wait for my permission to enter. He pushed the door open tightly, clutching a thick leather portfolio against his chest. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, his tie slightly askew from a lack of sleep. He forced a wide, completely unnatural smile onto his face, desperately attempting to project the calm, reassuring demeanor of a devoted son protecting his grieving father. He pulled a wooden dining chair from the corner of the room and placed it directly facing me. He sat down, leaning aggressively forward, invading my personal space with his frantic, uncontainable energy. He opened the leather portfolio and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents flagged with brightly colored sticky notes. He spoke with a rushed, breathless cadence, claiming he had spent the entire morning on the phone with high-level state officials. He told me that transferring the Lake Superior farms into a manageable family trust required immediate tax clearances. He spun a complex, highly fabricated narrative about impending state penalties and severe bureaucratic deadlines that would financially ruin me if left ignored. He pointed to the documents, referring to them as basic administrative waivers, specifically needed to protect my new assets from aggressive federal taxation. He promised that once these papers were filed, my financial future would be entirely secure, and I could simply rest without any lingering legal burdens. I stared at the thick paperwork resting on his knees. The bold headings on the pages were unmistakably clear to anyone who understood basic contract law. These were absolutely not administrative tax waivers. They were absolute, unconditional property transfer deeds. They were legally binding instruments explicitly designed to immediately strip the title of the Michigan land from my name and permanently assign it to Apex Holdings, Bradley's primary corporate shell company. Jordan was asking me to voluntarily hand over a multi-million-dollar freshwater aquifer to the exact man who was actively threatening to send him to federal prison. I slowly lifted my gaze from the fraudulent deeds and looked directly into my son's eyes. I searched his face for any lingering trace of the honorable boy I had raised. I vividly remembered running alongside him on the cracked sidewalks of our old neighborhood, holding the back of his bicycle seat until he finally found his balance and pedaled forward on his own. I remembered standing with him in front of the bathroom mirror, showing him the precise angle to hold a razor so he would not cut his skin, laughing as he wiped away the excess shaving cream. I remembered tying a perfect Windsor knot for his high school graduation, adjusting his collar and telling him how incredibly proud I was of the man he was becoming. I had poured every ounce of my love, my discipline, and my honor into his foundation. Now sitting mere inches away from me, that foundation was completely destroyed. He was eagerly trading his integrity for corporate approval, willing to drug and institutionalize his own father to salvage a toxic lifestyle he could not afford. I decided to give him one final, definitive chance at redemption. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely lucid. I dropped the confused, medicated facade for a brief, piercing moment. I asked Jordan to look me in the eye. I asked him if he was absolutely certain these papers were safe. I asked him if there was anything else he needed to tell me before I signed my name. I offered him a silent, desperate plea to confess the extortion, to admit his monumental financial failures, and to ask for my help to fight Bradley together. I would have instantly forgiven the shadow loans. I would have forgiven the forged collateral on my own house. If he had simply spoken the unvarnished truth in that room, I would have burned the entire world down to protect him. Jordan did not break eye contact. He did not flinch. His expression hardened into a cold mask of pure, self-preserving deceit. He looked at his father and swore on his own life that the documents were entirely for my protection. He told me to trust him. That single lie severed the final thread of paternal mercy in my heart. The boy I raised was dead, replaced entirely by a hollow, desperate corporate casualty. I broke eye contact and let the vacant, sluggish persona wash back over my features. I reached out with my right hand and took the heavy brass pen from his trembling fingers. I did not use my left hand this time. I did not create a jagged counterfeit scribble to invalidate the contract. I pressed the pen firmly against the paper and executed my authentic, legally flawless signature on every single dotted line. I signed away the Lake Superior farms. I signed away the subterranean aquifer. I handed the completed packet back to my son. Jordan snatched the documents from my hands with aggressive, triumphant speed. A massive wave of profound relief washed over his face, instantly melting away days of visible anxiety. He quickly packed the signed papers into his leather portfolio, gave me a brief, dismissive pat on the shoulder, and practically sprinted out of the bedroom. I listened to his heavy footsteps pounding down the wooden stairs, followed by the violent slam of the front door and the sharp screech of his car tires pulling rapidly out of the driveway. He was rushing straight to Bradley's corporate headquarters to deliver the ultimate prize. They honestly believed they had just successfully executed the greatest financial theft of their miserable lives. They believed they had stolen millions of dollars in pristine natural resources from a helpless, deteriorating old man. They were completely unaware that the land no longer belonged to me. The Lake Superior estate was already the legal, irrevocable property of a highly protected federal conservation trust. By forging the intent of those transfer deeds, actively signing them under false pretenses, and physically filing them across state lines to a corporate entity, Jordan and Bradley had just crossed a devastating legal threshold. They were not transferring private land. They were actively attempting to defraud the United States government. They had just committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud, and the steel jaws of my trap had finally snapped completely shut. The heavy front door slammed shut. Jordan was officially gone. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted with terrifying whiplash speed. The sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone Megan had meticulously maintained for the past several days evaporated the instant her husband's car cleared the driveway. She walked into the living room, her posture suddenly rigid, dismissive, and cold. She did not offer me a glass of water. She did not ask if I needed to rest my tired bones on the sofa. Her performance was officially over. Her mission was entirely complete, and I was now nothing more than an obsolete obstacle. She pulled her expensive smartphone from her pocket and made a brief, hushed, and urgent phone call. She spoke in sharp, clipped sentences, aggressively demanding immediate service. Exactly 45 minutes later, a heavy white transport van idled at the curb, its diesel engine rumbling. Two men stepped out onto the driveway. They were not gentle medical professionals. They were large, heavily muscled orderlies wearing blue scrubs that stretched tightly across their broad shoulders. They approached the front door with the brisk, impatient stride of men accustomed to subduing resistance through blunt physical force. Megan ripped the door open before they could even reach for the doorbell. She pointed a manicured finger directly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Her voice was devoid of human empathy. She instructed them to collect me quickly and quietly. She was laying the psychological groundwork to justify whatever force they deemed necessary. The two massive orderlies filled my bedroom doorway, their large frames blocking the exit. The lead orderly took a deliberate step forward, holding a pair of heavy nylon restraints casually in his right hand. He spoke to me in a slow, loud, and incredibly condescending voice, ordering me to stand up and move toward the door immediately. I gave him absolutely nothing to work with. I stood up with a slow, deliberate calmness that made him pause and lower the restraints. I turned my back to him, opened my closet door, retrieved a single weathered canvas duffel bag, and began packing. I packed 3 changes of clothes, a small bag of basic toiletries, and a heavy hardcover book. I moved with maximum calculated efficiency. As I folded my shirts, my mind flashed back to the grueling years of my military service. I had survived brutal sub-zero altitude training in the mountains. I had endured deep jungle survival courses where we were stripped of all tactical gear and left to outlast the hostile environment for weeks at a time. I had been repeatedly subjected to simulated hostile interrogations specifically designed to completely break a man's psychological foundation. I confidently zipped the canvas duffel bag shut, hoisted the strap onto my right shoulder, and walked directly toward the orderlies. They nervously stepped aside, visibly confused and deeply unsettled by my total lack of resistance. I walked steadily down the hardwood hallway, my heavy boots striking the floor with a rhythmic cadence. Megan stood waiting by the front door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched me approach with a look of supreme satisfaction plastered across her face. She firmly believed she had outsmarted a vulnerable, deteriorating old man. She believed she had successfully discarded a useless burden and forever secured her lavish corporate future. I stopped walking just inches away from her. The 2 heavy orderlies flanked me on either side, waiting impatiently for me to step out into the freezing afternoon air. Megan offered a fake, dramatized sigh of profound pity. She leaned in slightly, enveloping me in a cloud of cheap floral perfume. She told me I was going to a safe place where highly trained doctors could properly manage my rapidly declining mind. She offered a hollow promise that Jordan would visit me whenever he managed to find the free time. I looked down at her. I stopped shuffling my feet. I straightened my spine, instantly regaining my full physical height and presence. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes. I dropped the vacant, foggy, medicated stare entirely. My eyes were suddenly sharp-focused and completely lucid. I smiled at her. It was not the confused, harmless smile of a senile father-in-law. It was the precise, terrifying smile of a man who has just successfully lured his arrogant enemy into a minefield. Megan's smug expression instantly shattered. She actually took a sudden physical step backward, her spine hitting the hard wooden doorframe with a loud thud. A flash of deep, sudden panic crossed her perfectly manicured face. For a fraction of a second, the horrifying reality broke through her greed. She realized she was not looking at a helpless victim. She was looking at an executioner. I did not say a single word to break the tension. I simply turned my back on her and walked out the front door, stepping smoothly into the dark back of the waiting transport van. The drive across the county was brief, cold, and utterly silent. The heavy van pulled into the receiving bay of the Whispering Pines Care Facility. It was a bleak, cinder-block building surrounded by tall wire fencing. The harsh exterior practically radiated institutional despair. This was a notorious dumping ground for the forgotten, a grim facility specifically designed to warehouse inconvenient people until they quietly expired. The orderlies marched me roughly through a set of heavy steel double doors and directly into a sterile intake room. A bored intake nurse sat behind a wall of thick plexiglass. She coldly demanded my personal belongings. I handed her the canvas duffel bag through the narrow security slot. She dumped the contents onto a metal table, searching the fabric for hidden contraband. She then demanded my smartphone. I pulled the device from my trouser pocket and slid it through the transaction slot. She tossed it into a plastic evidence bin with a loud clatter. I was officially severed from the outside world. An orderly grabbed my arm and guided me forcefully down a long corridor smelling of bleach and stale boiled food. They pushed me into a small white room. It contained a narrow cot, a bolted metal chair, and a single reinforced window overlooking a concrete courtyard. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked into place with a final metallic thud. I stood perfectly still in the cold center of the locked white room. The barren, heavily reinforced concrete walls offered absolutely no comfort, but I did not require any. I was physically isolated. I was officially stripped of my phone, my private property, and my physical freedom. Megan and Jordan were undoubtedly celebrating their monumental victory, convinced they had silenced me permanently. They honestly believed they controlled the entire narrative. They were completely wrong. I walked slowly over to the narrow cot and sat down, a deep sense of immense satisfaction settling firmly in my chest. I did not need my confiscated phone to execute the final phase. Exactly 24 hours before Megan made her frantic phone call, Evelyn had legally registered my name and physical location directly with federal authorities under a protected whistleblower status. I was not a prisoner. I was a Trojan horse. The harsh, sterile light of the reinforced ceiling fixture hummed relentlessly, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. I sat on the edge of the rigid cot and allowed the profound silence of the isolation room to wash over me. Megan and the intake staff had thoroughly searched my canvas duffel bag, confidently stripping away my primary smartphone and my wallet, believing they had severed my only lifeline to the outside world. They possessed the predictable, fatal arrogance of low-level institutional bureaucrats. They only looked for exactly what they expected to find. They lacked the discipline to check the structural integrity of the luggage itself. I moved purposefully toward the small metal table where they had unceremoniously dumped my few approved belongings. I picked up my heavy, worn leather shaving kit. I ran my thumb along the thick bottom seam, locating a nearly invisible micro-zipper concealed perfectly beneath the reinforced nylon stitching. I pulled the zipper back and extracted a tiny prepaid burner phone. It was completely untraceable, equipped with a localized encrypted network and fully charged. I powered the device on the dim glow of the screen, illuminating my face in the stark white room. I immediately typed a secure alphanumeric code into the messaging application and hit send. Less than 10 seconds later, a single green checkmark appeared on the screen. Evelyn was actively monitoring the secure channel. She was ready to receive the critical intelligence I was currently positioned to gather. As I typed out my initial situation report, my mind registered the specific calculated reason I had chosen Evelyn to orchestrate this entire counteroffensive. Evelyn did not simply handle standard estate litigation or routine corporate contracts. She was a deeply feared apex predator in the legal community, and her firm possessed a highly specific, aggressively pursued specialty. She dedicated her life to dismantling corrupt medical facilities and predatory guardianship programs that specifically targeted vulnerable African American seniors. Throughout our community's history, wealthy corporate developers and shadow investors frequently utilize these exact types of low-budget, highly unregulated psychiatric wards to falsely imprison elderly minority property owners. They would heavily medicate them, strip away their physical autonomy, and seamlessly transfer their generational wealth into corporate holding companies using forged medical declarations. Evelyn had built her entire terrifying reputation by financially annihilating the doctor's facility directors and corporate sponsors who engineered these asset-stripping mills. Whispering Pines Care Facility was one of the most notorious offenders on her radar, a dark stain on the state registry that she had been desperately trying to infiltrate for years. By walking willingly through those heavy steel doors, I had essentially handed her the ultimate inside asset. I slipped the burner phone deep into the waistband of my trousers and immediately snapped into my tactical performance. I heard the unmistakable squeak of rubber-soled shoes approaching my reinforced door. I threw myself onto the narrow cot, twisting my body into an awkward, heavily slumped position. I let my jaw hang loose, half closing my eyes to mimic the vacant, chemically lobotomized stare of a patient who had just received a massive dose of institutional sedatives. I slowed my breathing down to a shallow, rhythmic wheeze. Decades of hostile survival training during brutal overseas deployments made this physical manipulation effortless. Spending a few days in a low-budget county psychiatric ward was an absolute vacation compared to the freezing, relentless misery of the mountain survival courses I had endured in the military. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly and the steel door swung open. The two massive, aggressive orderlies from the transport van stepped into the cramped room. They carried a plastic tray holding a small paper cup of medication and a plastic cup of water. They did not bother to speak to me. They took one look at my slack, unresponsive posture and immediately assumed the initial chemical restraints administered during my intake process were functioning perfectly. They believed I was entirely dead to the world. I reached discreetly into my waistband and pressed the tactile record button on the hidden burner phone, capturing high-definition audio of everything unfolding in the room. The lead orderly placed the plastic tray roughly on the metal table, letting out a loud, frustrated sigh. He complained bitterly to his partner about the miserable base pay provided by the facility. The second orderly chuckled darkly, leaning against the concrete wall. He told his partner to stop complaining aggressively, reminding him about the massive untaxed cash bonuses they received directly from the facility director at the end of every single month. The recording device silently captured every damning syllable. The second orderly casually detailed the exact mechanics of their illegal operation. He explicitly stated that Bradley, a billionaire real estate developer, aggressively funneled massive amounts of untraceable cash directly to the facility director. In exchange for this continuous financial bribery, the director strictly ordered his staff to keep specific, highly inconvenient relatives permanently confined to the maximum security wing. The orderly bragged openly about the specific protocols they used to keep wealthy patients heavily sedated, ensuring they could never request an independent legal counsel or demand an outside medical evaluation. He explicitly mentioned Jordan's recent drop-off, laughing about how desperate the young man looked when he handed his own father over to the ward. They discussed the specific dosage of antipsychotics they were instructed to forcefully administer to me if I ever demonstrated a single moment of absolute clarity. They were openly admitting to a massive, highly organized system of medical extortion, false imprisonment, and corporate bribery, all operating flawlessly under the protective guise of a legitimate healthcare facility. The orderlies finished their conversation entirely satisfied that I was a completely neutralized threat. They turned off the harsh overhead light, stepped out into the hallway, and slammed the heavy steel door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy, metallic finality. I waited exactly 5 minutes in the absolute darkness before dropping the medicated facade entirely. I sat up, smoothly retrieved the burner phone from my waistband, and stopped the audio recording. I quickly verified the sound quality. The audio was pristine. Every single admission of guilt, every mention of Bradley's specific cash payouts, and every detail of the forced sedation protocols was permanently digitized. I encrypted the audio file and transmitted it directly to Evelyn's secure server. The digital progress bar reached 100%, confirming the payload had successfully breached the facility walls. My phone buzzed silently in my hand. Evelyn's response was immediate and incredibly precise. She did not waste time with congratulations. She rapidly outlined the devastating sequence of events she was currently triggering on the outside. Evelyn was officially utilizing my verified presence inside the facility to initiate a massive multi-agency federal strike. She had already bypassed the corrupt local judges entirely. She was currently transmitting the raw audio file directly to the State Medical Oversight Board, demanding the immediate emergency suspension of the facility director's medical license. Simultaneously, she was feeding the extensive documentation of Bradley's shadow loans, Jordan's forged power of attorney, and the illegal institutional bribery directly to a specialized federal task force. Because Evelyn had legally registered my specific whistleblower status with the federal government a full 24 hours before Megan had me committed, my current confinement was no longer classified as a standard psychiatric hold. By physically locking me in this room and actively conspiring to heavily sedate me, the facility director, Jordan and Bradley, had unknowingly escalated their corporate theft into a severe federal kidnapping charge. They were officially attempting to silence a protected federal witness. Evelyn confirmed that the tactical trap was fully armed and rapidly closing. Federal agents were actively securing warrants based on the audio evidence I had just provided. The quiet, sterile walls of my concrete cell were no longer a prison. They were the heavily fortified epicenter of a massive, inescapable legal annihilation designed to completely destroy Bradley's entire corrupt empire. Bradley strode into the downtown state property registry with the absolute unshakable confidence of a monarch inspecting his conquered dominion. He did not wait in lines. He did not observe the standard bureaucratic protocols that governed ordinary powerless citizens. He bypassed the crowded public waiting area flanked closely by two of his most ruthless corporate litigators and approached the premium commercial processing desk. This was the exact arena where Bradley had meticulously built his sprawling, multi-million-dollar empire. For 3 decades, he had amassed his immense fortune by aggressively exploiting obscure legal loopholes and systematically crushing poor, vulnerable families. He specialized in hunting desperate people who were drowning in insurmountable debt, manipulating complex local foreclosure laws, and seizing their generational properties for fractions of their true market value. He had bribed local magistrates, intimidated county clerks, and effortlessly bulldozed through municipal zoning boards. He was entirely accustomed to fighting exhausted, terrified civilians who completely lacked the financial resources to defend themselves in a protracted legal battle. He had never in his entire predatory career faced an opponent who possessed the tactical brilliance to weaponize the immense crushing power of the United States federal government directly against him. He placed the thick leather portfolio on the worn laminate counter. He unclasped the heavy metal buckle and slid the stack of freshly signed transfer deeds across the desk toward the senior processing clerk. The documents appeared absolutely flawless. They bore the authentic, verified signature of a legally incapacitated man completely surrendering ownership of the massive Lake Superior agricultural farms and the underlying freshwater aquifer directly to Apex Holdings. Bradley smiled a cold, victorious smile, his eyes fixed on the clerk. He anticipated a brief flurry of keystrokes, the heavy thud of an official state rubber stamp, and the immediate, unconditional transfer of an asset worth tens of millions of dollars. The clerk, a tired woman wearing thick reading glasses, adjusted her monitor and began methodically inputting the specific geographical parcel identification numbers listed on the primary deed into the state database. The routine administrative silence of the office was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive electronic tone. The clerk's computer monitor instantly flashed with a solid bright red warning banner. She stopped typing, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She carefully re-entered the complex sequence of alphanumeric coordinates, audibly assuming she had made a simple typographical error. The system rejected the input, immediately locking the digital transfer screen completely. She looked up at Bradley, pushing her glasses down the bridge of her nose. She informed him in a flat, monotone voice that the transaction was permanently blocked. She turned her monitor slightly, revealing the stark, undeniable federal alert glowing brightly on the screen. The land he was aggressively attempting to seize did not belong to a private citizen. The massive Michigan estate was officially registered as a highly protected, impenetrable federal conservation trust. It was absolute sovereign territory of the national government. Bradley's confident, arrogant posture instantly disintegrated. He slammed his heavy hands down on the laminate counter, aggressively demanding the clerk manually override the system. He shouted that he possessed the legally binding signed authorization of the previous owner. His lead corporate litigator, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to dismantle legal obstacles, stepped forward to intimidate the clerk. He aggressively leaned over the counter to inspect the glowing red screen. The lawyer's eyes scanned the specific federal statutes and the digital timestamp of the Conservation Trust transfer. The aggressive, bullying demeanor vanished from the lawyer's face in a fraction of a second. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. He grabbed Bradley's arm with a frantic, trembling grip and violently pulled him away from the processing desk. The lawyer dragged Bradley into the echoing marble corridor of the state building, his voice dropping to an urgent, panicked whisper. He explicitly laid out the monumental, catastrophic reality of the situation they had just triggered. They had not just filed a contested civilian property deed. They had knowingly submitted forged, fraudulent documents across state lines in a deliberate, highly calculated attempt to seize protected government property. The lawyer explained with absolute terrifying clarity that the local bribed judges and compromised county sheriffs were completely powerless to protect them now. The jurisdiction had instantly shifted. By handing those specific papers to the state clerk, Bradley had just committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud. He had actively engaged in a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The lawyer released Bradley's arm and took a deliberate step backward, immediately calculating his own urgent need for independent criminal defense counsel. The penalty for this specific category of federal theft was not a simple corporate fine. It was an absolute minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Bradley stood paralyzed in the cold marble hallway, the crushing weight of his sudden complete annihilation suffocating him. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit pocket with shaking hands. He immediately dialed his office headquarters to initiate his emergency shredding protocol, desperately hoping to destroy the shadow loan ledgers and the physical proof of the forged power of attorney before the inevitable raid. His secretary answered the phone in hysterical tears. She did not greet him. She frantically screamed into the receiver that heavy black tactical vehicles had just smashed through the front security gates of their corporate campus. Teams of heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical armor bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI were actively tearing through the building. They were confiscating hard drives, smashing open locked file cabinets, and arresting the senior accounting staff right at their desks. The federal trap Evelyn had meticulously orchestrated from the shadows had slammed completely shut. The government was not just investigating the forged deeds. They were utilizing the attempted theft of federal land as the foundational justification to completely dismantle Bradley's entire corrupt empire. Bradley terminated the call, his breathing ragged and shallow. Blind, venomous rage entirely eclipsed his rising panic. He had been flawlessly outmaneuvered by a mechanic. The fragile, broken old man he had so eagerly mocked and underestimated had completely destroyed his life with a single, perfectly executed stroke of a pen. Bradley sprinted out of the state building and threw himself into the back of his waiting armored SUV. He bypassed his panicking legal team completely. He dialed Jordan's number, his voice a low, animalistic growl. When Jordan answered, expecting praise and his promised financial reward, Bradley unleashed a torrent of absolute fury. He informed his son-in-law that the FBI was currently raiding the corporate headquarters and that federal indictments for wire fraud were imminent. He explicitly blamed Jordan for walking them both directly into a federal ambush. Jordan stammered helplessly on the other end of the line, completely unable to comprehend the monumental scale of the catastrophe. Bradley did not give him time to speak. The billionaire developer made a rapid, ruthless pivot to absolute damage control. The only tangible physical link connecting Bradley to the initial forged power of attorney and the illegal psychiatric confinement was the old man currently locked inside the Whispering Pines care facility. If Lawrence survived to testify in a federal courtroom, Bradley would spend the rest of his natural life behind steel bars. Bradley disconnected the call to Jordan and immediately dialed a heavily encrypted, untraceable offshore number. He bypassed his lawyers and his accountants entirely. He contacted his most violent, utterly merciless heavy fixers. He transmitted the exact address of the isolated psychiatric ward. He delivered a single chilling and completely unambiguous directive. They were to breach the facility immediately, locate the old man in the maximum security wing, and silence him permanently before federal agents could reach the Trojan horse. The heavy steel deadbolt of my isolation room retracted with a sharp, echoing snap. The door swung inward, but the men standing in the threshold were not the complaining, underpaid orderlies from the previous shift. Two men stepped into the cramped concrete space. They wore generic dark suits that fit poorly over their heavily muscled frames, completely lacking any medical identification or facility badges. They possessed the cold mechanical efficiency of career predators who were explicitly paid to make inconvenient problems permanently disappear. The taller of the two held a thick leather restraint belt and a loaded syringe with a needle long enough to puncture deep muscle tissue. They did not introduce themselves. They did not attempt to coax me into compliance with fake patronizing warmth. The shorter man simply stepped forward and ordered me to stand up, explicitly stating that I was being transferred to a specialized, undisclosed long-term care wing at a remote sister facility. It was a thinly veiled euphemism for a shallow, unmarked grave in the dense Michigan woods. I remained seated on the edge of the narrow cot. I did not cower, and I did not break eye contact. I looked directly at the loaded syringe. I knew exactly what Bradley had ordered them to do. A massive dose of untraceable chemical sedatives would simulate a tragic, unexpected cardiac event during transit. It was the standard operating procedure for silencing loose ends. The tall man grew impatient with my absolute stillness. He stepped aggressively toward the cot, raising the syringe to eye level, fully intending to plunge the needle into my neck and drag my unconscious body out the back delivery doors. I did not flinch. I simply shifted my weight, preparing to utilize the hand-to-hand combat techniques I had ingrained into my muscle memory decades ago. I was fully prepared to shatter his knee and crush his windpipe. Before the fixer could close the final 2 feet between us, a deafening crash reverberated through the corridor outside. The sound of heavy tactical boots thundering against the cracked linoleum floor completely drowned out the low hum of the fluorescent lights. The shorter fixer turned his head sharply toward the open doorway, reaching instinctively beneath his tailored jacket. He never completed the motion. A team of heavily armored United States federal marshals flooded the hallway, their weapons drawn, and leveled directly at the 2 counterfeit orderlies. A booming, authoritative voice ordered the men to drop their weapons and lace their fingers behind their heads. The fixers, immediately recognizing the overwhelming lethal force of a federal raid, dropped the syringe and complied instantly. Evelyn stepped through the wall of armed tactical officers and entered my cell. She wore a pristine, sharp white trench coat, her expression radiating absolute, uncompromising authority. She did not look at the 2 fixers currently being forced to their knees and tightly handcuffed. She looked directly at me and offered a brief, satisfied nod. Following closely behind Evelyn was the lead federal marshal, a towering, broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and a silver badge gleaming on his tactical vest. He holstered his weapon and looked around the bleak, deplorable conditions of the isolation room with profound disgust. Evelyn and this specific federal commander shared a deep, highly symbiotic professional history. 5 years prior, his career had stalled completely within the sluggish bureaucracy of the Justice Department. He had been desperately trying to build a viable criminal case against a sprawling, deeply entrenched network of illegal Medicare fraud. Evelyn had systematically dismantled the financial shielding of the corrupt medical syndicate, handing him the exact, irrefutable banking ledgers he needed to launch a massive sting operation. Her precise legal intelligence had saved his career, resulting in dozens of high-profile convictions, and his immediate promotion to lead marshal. When Evelyn called him directly on his secure line to report a federal kidnapping and wire fraud conspiracy occurring inside the Whispering Pines care facility, he had mobilized his elite extraction unit within 20 minutes. The lead marshal stepped out of the cell and confronted the facility director, who was currently being dragged down the hallway in tight steel handcuffs. The director was visibly hyperventilating, desperately trying to invoke medical confidentiality laws to stop the raid. The marshal pulled a thick stack of federal warrants from his tactical vest and shoved them directly into the director's chest. He explicitly informed the sweating, terrified administrator that his entire facility was being seized under federal asset forfeiture laws for actively conspiring to hold a protected government whistleblower against his will. The director's legs gave out and 2 deputies had to physically carry him toward the waiting transport vehicles. Evelyn walked over to the metal table where my confiscated belongings had been originally dumped. She handed me the thick federal court order she had personally procured from a district judge hours earlier. It was an unassailable legal mandate declaring my absolute mental competence, officially nullifying any fabricated psychiatric hold initiated by my son or his wife. I took the heavy document, feeling the rough texture of the premium legal paper. The charade was officially over. I no longer needed to play the role of the broken, helpless old man. I opened my weathered canvas duffel bag. I bypassed the casual clothing I had packed on top and retrieved a meticulously pressed, tailored charcoal suit sealed in a protective plastic garment bag. I asked the marshals for exactly 3 minutes of privacy. They cleared the room and pulled the heavy steel door closed. I stripped away the cheap, institutional gray scrubs they had forced upon me during intake. I dressed myself with slow, deliberate precision. I fastened the cuffs of my crisp white shirt, adjusted the dark silk tie, and slipped into the tailored jacket. I ran a comb through my hair and straightened my posture. I transformed back into the formidable, uncompromising man who had meticulously engineered Bradley's complete destruction. I pushed the steel door open and stepped out into the chaotic, brightly lit corridor. The federal agents respectfully cleared a path as Evelyn and I walked side by side toward the main exit. The remaining medical staff stood frozen against the walls, their faces pale with terror as they watched their corrupt empire burn to the ground. I did not glance at them. We pushed through the heavy front glass doors of the facility and stepped out into the freezing, crisp Michigan air. The parking lot was filled with flashing red and blue tactical lights, casting long, frantic shadows across the concrete. Evelyn guided me toward her sleek black town car waiting idly near the perimeter fence. Her driver opened the rear door and I slid into the heated leather seat. Evelyn sat beside me, her eyes scanning her tablet as she monitored the rapidly unfolding federal indictments against Bradley's shell companies. I leaned my head back against the headrest, feeling the deep, vibrating hum of the engine. I was entirely free from the physical confines of the corrupt psychiatric ward. My mind was sharp, and my tactical position was completely secure. However, a stark, sobering reality settled heavily over my thoughts. I was legally vindicated, but I was also technically homeless. The expansive suburban house I had paid for with decades of grueling manual labor was still currently bound by Jordan's forged power of attorney. If I simply returned to my own front door, I would be trespassing on a property actively controlled by a man who had eagerly signed my death warrant. I could not go home. Not yet. The board needed to be entirely cleared before I reclaimed my physical territory. I turned to Evelyn and instructed her to bypass the suburban routes entirely. I told her to drive me straight into the heart of the city's financial district. She relayed the new coordinates to her driver without a single question. 30 minutes later, the heavy town car pulled up to the gilded entrance of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. It was a soaring tower of glass and steel, a fortress of extreme wealth that catered exclusively to the absolute elite. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the grand marble lobby. I approached the premium concierge desk and secured their largest, most secure penthouse suite, paying upfront with a shielded corporate account Evelyn had established for me. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor and stepped into the sprawling, impeccably designed suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I stood near the glass, watching the distant glittering lights of the corporate towers. My brother's legacy was safe. Bradley's empire was currently bleeding out in the hands of federal agents. The counterfeit doctors were sitting in holding cells. Every single mercenary and corrupt official had been systematically neutralized. There was only one loose end remaining on the board. My son was sitting in my house completely unaware that his billionaire protector was currently facing decades in federal prison. Jordan believed he had won. He believed he had successfully discarded me. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and set it down on the polished mahogany dining table. It was time to drop the hammer on my son. The devastating shockwave of the federal raid hit Bradley's corporate empire with absolute surgical precision. He sat barricaded inside his secondary off-the-books executive office, staring with hollow, bloodshot eyes at his private terminal. Every single primary banking portal displayed the exact same terrifying error code. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially executed a blanket freeze on all his corporate and personal assets. His vast network of offshore holding companies, shadow accounts, and heavily shielded real estate trusts had been entirely neutralized in a matter of hours. The flawless digital fortress he had spent 3 decades building was completely locked down. Bradley picked up his encrypted desk phone and dialed Jordan. He did not yell. His voice was completely devoid of its usual booming arrogance, replaced instead by a cold, metallic pragmatism that was far more menacing. He ordered Jordan to meet him at a deserted industrial park on the extreme edge of the city limits immediately. He offered absolutely no further explanation before severing the connection. When Jordan arrived at the designated location, his tailored suit was wrinkled and soaked with cold, nervous sweat. He stumbled out of his car into the damp evening air, his chest heaving with sheer panic, desperately demanding to know why the corporate headquarters was swarming with federal tactical units. Bradley stood entirely cloaked in the shadows of a decaying, abandoned warehouse. He delivered his ultimatum with the ruthless, unfeeling efficiency of a corporate butcher. He explicitly informed Jordan that the federal government possessed irrefutable high-definition audio evidence of the psychiatric ward conspiracy and undeniable digital proof of the forged property deeds. Bradley stated that the only possible way to salvage the surviving remnants of his real estate firm and protect Megan's massive untaxed inheritance was for a single, isolated individual to take the absolute brunt of the federal indictments. He stepped aggressively into Jordan's personal space, demanding that his son-in-law immediately sign a full legally binding confession, claiming sole responsibility for the entire fraudulent operation. Bradley promised to eventually funnel untraceable cash to Jordan's prison commissary account while he served his mandatory 20-year sentence. It was not a request. It was a direct, inescapable command from a man who viewed human beings entirely as disposable currency. Jordan physically recoiled, the color draining completely from his face. The horrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon him with a crushing, suffocating weight. He had eagerly sold his own father's freedom, dignity, and legacy to appease a billionaire who was now casually ordering him to spend the next 2 decades rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Jordan shook his head violently outright, refusing the horrific demand. He turned his back on his father-in-law, sprinted back to his vehicle, and slammed his foot violently onto the accelerator. He was entirely out of options. The federal authorities were rapidly closing in from one side, and Bradley's ruthless, violent fixers were undoubtedly preparing to silence him from the other. His only remaining play was absolute immediate flight. Jordan drove recklessly through the darkening city streets, running multiple red lights and swerving aggressively through heavy traffic as he raced desperately back to the suburban house he had stolen from his father. He intended to clean out the hidden emergency cash safe bolted inside the master bedroom closet, grab his passport, and drive straight across the northern border before his name officially hit the federal no-fly list. He threw the front door open, his breathing ragged and shallow, and sprinted heavily up the hardwood stairs. He tore into the bedroom, ripping open the closet doors and pulling a large, heavy leather travel bag from the top shelf. He began frantically hurling clothes, expensive watches, and thick stacks of banded currency into the open bag, moving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a trapped, desperate animal. Megan stepped silently into the bedroom doorway. She did not ask him what was wrong. She did not offer a comforting embrace or project the fake supportive demeanor she had meticulously maintained for years. She stood perfectly still, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, firmly blocking his only exit. Her posture was entirely relaxed, projecting an aura of supreme, unaffected boredom. Jordan looked up from his frantic packing, his eyes wide with desperate urgency. He pleaded with her to grab her passport and a coat. He rapidly explained that the federal government was actively seizing the company and that Bradley was attempting to force him to take the sole fall for the entire massive conspiracy. He begged his wife to run away with him, promising they could start over somewhere completely untraceable, far away from the reach of the FBI. Megan did not move a single inch. A slow, chilling smile spread across her perfectly manicured face. She looked at the frantic, sweating man she had married and delivered a psychological strike that shattered his remaining sanity completely. She told him he was absolutely pathetic. Her voice dripped with pure, unadulterated venom, entirely stripping away the mask of the loving wife. She explicitly revealed the devastating truth behind their entire relationship. She had never loved him. She had never respected his blind ambition or admired his weak, easily manipulated character. Bradley had specifically selected Jordan years ago because he was an insecure, desperate, and remarkably gullible target. Megan had married him simply to install a highly controllable pawn within Lawrence's family structure. Jordan was nothing more than a convenient disposable tool specifically acquired to eventually separate Lawrence from his highly valuable generational land. Jordan froze completely, his hands trembling violently above his packed travel bag. The sheer, calculated malice in her words paralyzed him entirely. Megan pulled her expensive smartphone from her pocket and tapped the glossy screen deliberately. She informed her husband that she had not spent the last several weeks simply standing by while he forged legal documents and drugged his father. She had actively and meticulously recorded every single one of his nervous, frantic confessions inside that very house. She possessed hours of crystal-clear audio files of Jordan explicitly detailing how he orchestrated the fraudulent property deeds and explicitly describing his direct role in having Lawrence illegally committed to the psychiatric ward. Megan coldly explained that she was handing this mountain of pristine, undeniable evidence directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was intentionally and mercilessly throwing her husband to the wolves to completely shield her father from criminal prosecution. The absolute crushing magnitude of his monumental failure finally consumed Jordan. He had systematically destroyed his entire life for a complete illusion. He vividly remembered looking directly into the eyes of a father who had loved him unconditionally, a man who had sacrificed everything to build a solid foundation for him, and he had actively chosen to betray that man for corporate approval. He had traded his loyal, devoted father for a vicious, calculating woman who was currently using his total destruction as a simple bargaining chip to protect her corrupt family. Megan kept her eyes locked securely on Jordan's pale, terrified face. She slowly raised her phone to her ear. She informed the local emergency dispatcher that a highly dangerous, mentally unstable man was currently attempting to destroy her property. She requested immediate police intervention, officially executing the final phase of her betrayal. The distinct, piercing wail of approaching police sirens instantly echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood, growing rapidly louder and more aggressive by the second. Pure, blinding panic finally broke through Jordan's heavy paralysis. He knew with absolute certainty that if those officers placed him in handcuffs, he would never see the outside of a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. He abandoned his packed travel bag on the bed. He abandoned the thick stacks of stolen currency. He sprinted rapidly away from the bedroom door, completely bypassing Megan. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy glass of the second-story window. The glass shattered outward with a violent, explosive crash, sending jagged shards raining down into the yard. Jordan tumbled aggressively through the broken frame, falling heavily onto the sloping, shingled roof below. He scrambled frantically down the steep incline, tearing his hands on the rough shingles, and dropped awkwardly onto the soft grass of the backyard. He did not look back at the beautiful suburban house he had so callously stolen. He sprinted blindly into the dense, dark woods bordering the property line just as the flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers flooded the front driveway, casting frantic, sweeping shadows across the lawn. He tore through the thick underbrush, his expensive clothes snagging on sharp branches, his chest burning with absolute exhaustion and pure terror. Jordan was entirely stripped of his wealth, his toxic marriage, and his stolen property. He was now a hunted, desperate fugitive, running entirely out of time, completely unaware that his father was currently watching the entire collapse unfold from the pristine heights of a luxury penthouse suite, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. The sun rose over the city, casting a brilliant golden light across the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit and checked my watch. Federal authorities had successfully processed Jordan during the night. He was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell, completely denied bail, facing the absolute reality of a federal wire fraud indictment. Now only one trespasser remained on my property. I rode the private elevator down to the marble lobby, stepping out into the crisp, sharp morning air. Evelyn was already waiting by the curb in her sleek black town car. Beside her stood Sheriff Miller, a stern veteran law enforcement officer who had known my family for 2 decades. I greeted them both with a firm handshake. We did not waste time with pleasantries. The objective was completely clear. We slid into the vehicle, and the driver navigated smoothly toward the quiet, affluent suburbs where my house was located. As the familiar tree-lined streets of my neighborhood came into view, a profound wave of clarity washed over me. I looked at the expansive suburban house approaching through the tinted windows. I remembered the grueling months of physical exertion it took to build that structure into a true home. I vividly recalled measuring, cutting, and securing every single timber of the wide wooden porch with my own 2 hands. Every nail driven into those sturdy planks held a distinct memory of honest, back-breaking labor. I had spent countless weekends covered in sawdust and sweat, meticulously sanding the railings so my wife could sit comfortably outside during the warm summer evenings. The property was a physical manifestation of my life's unwavering discipline. It was built on a foundation of absolute integrity, purchased with untainted currency, and maintained with quiet pride. Megan had casually invaded that sacred space, assuming she could simply absorb my history and claim it as her own unearned luxury. She believed her father's predatory corporate lawyers would perpetually shield her from any earthly consequence. She was about to receive a devastating education in accountability. The heavy town car pulled smoothly into the driveway, parking directly behind Megan's expensive imported luxury sedan. I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching softly against the gravel. Sheriff Miller adjusted his utility belt, resting his hand casually near his radio, and marched up the walkway beside me. Evelyn flanked my right side, firmly clutching a thick leather portfolio containing the irrefutable instruments of Megan's immediate downfall. The morning was entirely quiet, the neighborhood completely oblivious to the massive tactical strike that had annihilated Bradley's empire just hours prior. I stepped onto the wooden porch I had built with my own hands and pressed the doorbell. We waited in absolute silence. Through the frosted glass panels of the heavy oak door, I saw a blurred figure moving lazily down the hallway. Megan pulled the door open casually, holding a steaming ceramic mug of imported coffee. She was dressed in an expensive silk robe, projecting an aura of supreme, unaffected boredom. She expected a package delivery or a subservient landscape worker. The smug, irritated expression on her face instantly disintegrated. The ceramic mug slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor and sending scalding dark liquid splashing across her bare ankles. She stared at me in total paralyzing shock. She was looking at a man she firmly believed was heavily sedated and permanently locked inside a high-security psychiatric ward. Instead, I was standing completely lucid, dressed in a sharp suit and backed directly by armed law enforcement. She stammered wildly, instinctively stepping backward and attempting to slam the heavy oak door in our faces. Sheriff Miller swiftly planted his heavy boot firmly inside the doorframe, stopping the timber dead in its tracks. He pushed the door wide open and stepped into the foyer with absolute uncompromising authority. Megan shrieked frantically, demanding that we leave her property immediately. She confidently threatened to call her father's elite legal team, boasting that Bradley would personally ensure we were all heavily sued for trespassing. Evelyn stepped smoothly forward, her posture radiating pure, unadulterated legal dominance. She did not raise her voice. She opened her leather portfolio and extracted a stack of heavily stamped federal documents. She calmly informed Megan that Bradley was currently entirely incapable of dispatching any lawyers to assist her. She explicitly detailed the massive coordinated federal raid that had completely dismantled Bradley's corporate headquarters the previous night. She explained that Bradley's personal and corporate bank accounts were permanently frozen under federal indictment, and his elite legal fixers were frantically preparing their own criminal defense strategies. Evelyn then handed a specific brightly stamped document directly to Sheriff Miller. She stated with crystalline legal precision that the power of attorney Jordan had utilized to transfer the suburban property was officially classified as a federal forgery. Consequently, the fraudulent transaction was immediately voided. The house legally reverted entirely to my sole ownership. Megan possessed absolutely zero legal right to occupy the premises. She was an uninvited squatter trespassing on protected private property. Megan's arrogant facade completely collapsed into sheer, breathless panic. Her eyes darted frantically around the grand foyer, searching for an escape from the crushing reality that her entire fraudulent life had evaporated in a matter of seconds. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his voice booming through the quiet house. He delivered a strict, non-negotiable ultimatum. He informed Megan that she had exactly 1 hour to pack her personal belongings and vacate the premises immediately. If she remained inside the house 1 minute past the deadline, she would be forcefully arrested and aggressively prosecuted for criminal trespassing. He explicitly warned her that any attempt to stall the eviction process would result in immediate physical removal. Megan spun around and sprinted frantically up the hardwood staircase, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished steps. I stood silently in the foyer, alongside Evelyn and the sheriff, listening to the chaotic sounds of doors slamming, drawers being ripped open, and hangers violently clattering inside the master bedroom. Exactly 55 minutes later, Megan stomped heavily down the staircase. She was dragging a single oversized designer suitcase behind her. Her face was flushed bright red with pure, uncontained fury. She had lost her husband, her billionaire father's protection, and the stolen luxury home she had so eagerly claimed as her own. As she reached the bottom step, her eyes locked onto a beautiful, intricately painted porcelain vase resting on a decorative mahogany side table. It was a priceless family heirloom that my late wife and I had purchased during our first anniversary trip overseas. The vase held immense sentimental value, representing a lifetime of shared memories and enduring love. A dark, spiteful shadow crossed Megan's face. In a sudden, explosive fit of sheer vindictive rage, she aggressively lunged toward the table. She raised her right arm high into the air, fully intending to violently sweep the fragile heirloom off the pedestal and smash it into 1,000 irreplaceable pieces against the floorboards. She drastically underestimated my physical awareness. I moved with explosive, blinding speed. I closed the distance, instantly catching her descending wrist securely in midair. My grip was like a steel vise, instantly halting her destructive momentum. Megan gasped, her eyes widening in genuine physical terror as she hopelessly attempted to wrench her arm free from my iron grasp. I did not release the pressure. I leaned in close, keeping my voice incredibly low, steady, and utterly lethal. I calmly informed her that the vase was officially appraised at over $10,000. I explicitly promised her that if she caused even a single microscopic scratch to the porcelain surface or damaged any other property in my home, I would ensure she was immediately arrested for felony vandalism and aggressively prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of federal law. I released her wrist with a sharp, dismissive shove. Megan stumbled backward, clutching her bruised arm tightly against her chest. Her vindictive rage was entirely replaced by absolute whimpering submission. She did not say a single word. She grabbed the handle of her designer suitcase and scurried out the front door like a thoroughly beaten animal. I stepped out onto the wooden porch and watched her drag her heavy luggage across the asphalt, the small plastic wheels rattling loudly in the quiet suburban morning. She was officially banished from my property, entirely stripped of the unearned luxury she had viciously attempted to steal from a grieving father. She had arrived expecting to inherit an empire, and she was leaving with absolutely nothing but a single suitcase and the crushing, inescapable weight of her complete and total annihilation. The driveway remained perfectly silent as her imported sedan finally disappeared around the bend. The morning air remained sharp, biting, and relentlessly cold as Evelyn's town car navigated away from the quiet suburban streets and merged smoothly onto the main highway heading back into the city center. We were not returning to the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse suite. The vast legal machinery we had meticulously set into motion was accelerating with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. Evelyn had secured an emergency convening of a federal grand jury. The sheer magnitude of the conspiracy involving the attempted theft of protected government land and the kidnapping of a registered federal whistleblower required immediate judicial intervention. We arrived at the imposing heavy limestone facade of the federal courthouse just as the sky began to heavily overcast, threatening a brutal winter storm. I walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps beside Evelyn, my tailored charcoal suit offering a physical armor against the lingering exhaustion of the past several weeks. Inside the building, the atmosphere was charged with an intense, hushed urgency. Federal prosecutors, severe men and women who dealt exclusively in absolute facts and devastating prison sentences, reviewed Evelyn's meticulously compiled dossiers. We were escorted silently into a secure, wood-paneled antechamber just outside the main grand jury room. I sat in a heavy leather chair, perfectly composed. I did not feel the nervous, frantic energy that typically consumed men caught in complex legal crossfires. I was entirely grounded in the absolute truth of my survival. Evelyn stood confidently before the grand jury, presenting the dense network of evidence with the clinical, merciless precision of a seasoned predator executing a calculated kill. She did not rely on emotional appeals, dramatic rhetoric, or theatrical gestures. She built a flawless, interlocking chain of undeniable facts. She methodically established the timeline of the forged power of attorney, the predatory shadow loans, and the illegal psychiatric confinement. Then she introduced the ultimate, inescapable smoking gun. The digital audio file I had recorded inside my own dining room was patched directly into the courtroom's primary speaker system. The massive room fell into absolute suffocating silence as Bradley's booming, arrogant voice echoed sharply off the polished wood-paneled walls. The recording captured him explicitly extorting my son, systematically detailing the exact mechanics of seizing the Lake Superior farms and brutally threatening Jordan with federal prison if he failed to comply with the corporate theft. Every single syllable of his corporate malice, every ruthless command was permanently digitized and played back for the grim-faced federal prosecutors. Bradley had spent his entire adult life operating under the profound, blinding delusion that his extreme insulated wealth made him entirely invisible to earthly consequence. He firmly believed his offshore accounts, his aggressive corporate litigators, and his high-priced fixers placed him functionally above the law. He had vastly underestimated the quiet, relentless discipline of a military mechanic. During my service, maintaining the intricate, complex machinery of our armored transport vehicles was never a casual duty. It was an absolute matter of life and death. You tracked every single anomaly, documented every microscopic structural fracture, and never ignored a failing component because overlooking a minor detail resulted in catastrophic failure on the battlefield. I had simply applied that exact same rigorous mechanical discipline to Bradley's sprawling criminal conspiracy. I had meticulously documented his structural flaws, recorded his failing ethical components, tracked his illegal financial maneuvers, and handed the completely assembled diagnostic report directly to the federal government. I did not fight him with money. I dismantled his empire with absolute unassailable truth. The audio recording completely annihilated any potential legal defense Bradley could possibly mount. It was a pristine, unassailable confession of federal extortion and conspiracy to commit widespread wire fraud. The grand jury did not require lengthy deliberations to understand the magnitude of the crime. Federal warrants were issued immediately, stamped heavily with the undeniable crushing authority of the United States government. The elite strike teams that had already raided Bradley's corporate headquarters were instantly authorized to execute a physical, tactical capture of the billionaire himself. Meanwhile, miles away from the strict confines of the federal courthouse, Bradley was actively executing his final desperate maneuver. The catastrophic freezing of his global banking network had alerted him to the terminal nature of his situation. He bypassed his sprawling suburban estate and abandoned his collection of luxury vehicles, coordinating a rapid, panicked extraction to a private, heavily shielded airstrip on the desolate rural outskirts of the city. He intended to board an unregistered Gulfstream jet and disappear permanently into a non-extradition country before the federal warrants could be physically processed through the system. He moved with the frantic, terrified urgency of a fallen dictator watching his invincible palace burn to the ground. The high-pitched whining of the jet engines grew louder as he hurried across the cracked asphalt of the secluded runway, clutching a single reinforced briefcase containing his remaining untraceable assets. Bradley reached eagerly for the cold aluminum railing of the boarding stairs, firmly convinced he had successfully slipped through the closing net. He was completely wrong. A massive, heavily armored tactical transport vehicle smashed violently through the chain-link perimeter fence of the airstrip, its heavy tires tearing up the frozen earth and sending sparks flying across the tarmac. 4 unmarked black SUVs immediately followed the breach, violently swerving across the runway to completely block the private jet's path of departure. Armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, their tactical rifles raised and locked directly onto Bradley's chest. The lead agent's voice boomed over a heavy bullhorn, commanding the billionaire to step away from the aircraft and drop immediately to his knees. Bradley stood frozen on the tarmac, the fierce, deafening roar of the jet engines providing a chaotic mechanical soundtrack to his absolute destruction. His highly paid, heavily armed security detail offered zero resistance, immediately dropping their weapons and surrendering to the overwhelming federal force. Bradley's knees finally buckled. He dropped heavily to the cold asphalt, the expensive reinforced briefcase slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the ground with a dull, pathetic thud. Federal agents violently forced his arms behind his back, securing his wrists tightly with heavy steel cuffs. The sprawling, predatory empire he had spent 3 decades building on the shattered lives of vulnerable people was completely eradicated in a single devastating evening. Evelyn received the encrypted confirmation of the arrest as we sat in the quiet warmth of her town car, navigating the bustling evening city traffic. She read the brief tactical report aloud, a cold, profoundly satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. Bradley was in federal custody, entirely stripped of his wealth, his terrifying power, and his freedom. Megan was banished, wandering the city with nothing but a single suitcase and her shattered pride. The corporate threat was permanently extinguished. However, a profound, heavy silence settled in the back of the car as I looked out at the passing streetlights blurring against the glass. The immediate tactical victory was absolute, but the devastating emotional war was not yet finished. The federal prosecutors required my direct verbal testimony to officially seal the massive convictions. I had successfully dismantled the enemy network and reclaimed my stolen family legacy. Now I faced the most grueling, agonizing phase of the entire grueling ordeal. The impending federal trial demanded my physical presence in the courtroom. I was legally required to sit on the witness stand, look directly into the terrified eyes of my own son, and systematically testify to his absolute betrayal in a court of law. Part 17. The Courtroom. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung open with a deep echoing thud, physically separating the chaotic media circus outside from the sterile, unforgiving arena of the United States justice system. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my posture rigidly straight, my eyes locked securely on the elevated judge's bench ahead. The massive courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Federal prosecutors, elite defense attorneys, and a gallery of eager spectators filled every available wooden bench. At the primary defense table sat Bradley, wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit that completely failed to hide the deep, exhausted lines etched into his pale face. At the adjacent table, separated by a wide, intentional gap, sat my son. Jordan wore a standard-issue, brightly colored prison uniform, He looked physically diminished, his shoulders slumped heavily forward, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Bradley's elite defense team wasted absolutely no time executing their primary, highly calculated strategy. During their aggressive opening statements, the lead attorney painted a meticulously crafted picture of me. He described a bitter, thoroughly confused old man who had tragically misunderstood a standard, perfectly legal corporate real estate transaction. The slick lawyer boldly suggested to the jury that my advanced age and lingering grief had manifested as a severe vindictive paranoia driving me to irrationally frame his upstanding billionaire client. It was a predictable, desperate narrative designed entirely to discredit my mental acuity from the very first minute of the trial. Evelyn stood confidently from the prosecutor's table and formally called me to the witness stand. I navigated the short wooden steps with precise, measured movements, taking my seat and placing my calloused hands flat against the polished railing. I swore the mandatory oath with a clear, resonant voice that easily carried to the back of the silent room. The defense attorney immediately attempted to rattle my composure during his initial hostile cross-examination. He asked rapid, heavily loaded, condescending questions, deliberately attempting to confuse the chronological timeline and provoke an emotional, angry outburst for the jury to witness. I did not give him a single ounce of satisfaction. The military had ingrained a profound, unbreakable psychological discipline within me decades ago. I answered every single question with sharp, mechanical precision. I systematically stripped away the complex, confusing legal jargon and laid out the exact, irrefutable sequence of the entire conspiracy. I spoke loudly and clearly, my voice projecting an undeniable, unshakable authority across the vast courtroom. I maintained absolute eye contact with the defense attorney until he was forced to look away. The jury leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated by the stark, undeniable contrast between the defense's false claim of a confused senior citizen and the highly articulate, deeply focused tactician sitting calmly before them. Evelyn seamlessly took control of the questioning, expertly guiding the attentive jury through the impenetrable fortress of evidence I had meticulously assembled. I explicitly described how Jordan had systematically drugged my evening tea over the course of several weeks. I presented the certified chemical analysis of the dead plant soil retrieved from my living room, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the earth was heavily saturated with high-grade prescription sedatives, matching the exact chemical compound reported missing from the counterfeit psychiatric facility. I detailed the precise forensic discrepancies in the forged property deeds, specifically highlighting the digital timestamps that proved my signature was electronically manufactured while I was physically locked inside the isolated medical ward. Finally, Evelyn formally introduced the audio tapes. The courtroom fell into absolute, breathless silence as my hidden recordings were broadcast clearly through the central overhead speakers. The jury listened in collective horror to the undeniable sound of Jordan practicing my signature, followed immediately by Bradley explicitly orchestrating the hostile theft of the Lake Superior farms. The crystal-clear audio completely dismantled the defense's carefully constructed narrative of a simple misunderstanding. I was undeniably not a confused, vindictive old man. I was a highly organized investigator who had systematically documented a massive federal crime from the inside out. Bradley's lead attorney, visibly sweating under the crushing, suffocating weight of the irrefutable evidence, desperately pivoted his failing strategy. He aggressively attempted to attack my character, suggesting to the judge that I harbored a deep, unnatural hatred for my son, and that this entire federal investigation was simply a malicious act of paternal revenge. He demanded to know exactly when I had decided to viciously turn against my own flesh and blood. I looked directly at the sweating lawyer, my expression entirely devoid of malice or regret. I calmly told the courtroom that my son had truly died long before the forged property deeds were ever drafted. I recounted a specific, painfully clear memory for the silent jury. 5 years ago, I stood in a quiet, dimly lit chapel preparing to deliver the final eulogy at my wife's memorial service. I had waited anxiously by the heavy wooden doors, watching the clock tick well past the scheduled start time, desperately hoping my son would arrive to honor the woman who had devoted her entire life to him. Jordan never walked through those chapel doors. He had sent a brief, incredibly cold text message stating he could not attend because Bradley had scheduled a mandatory executive strategy meeting. That was the exact moment I realized Jordan was permanently lost to greed. He had willingly traded his mother's memory for a seat at a billionaire's table, The profound stoic clarity of my response hung heavily in the courtroom, entirely neutralizing the defense's pathetic attempt to paint me as a vindictive father. The jury looked at Jordan with overwhelming, undisguised contempt. The high-profile trial was rapidly slipping away from Bradley's elite defense team. The physical evidence was unassailable, the audio recordings were incredibly damning, and my verbal testimony was absolutely unbreakable. Bradley leaned over the heavy wooden table and whispered frantically into his lead attorney's ear. The lawyer's face tightened with sudden, ruthless resolve. He stood up, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and executed a final, desperate maneuver that sent a massive shockwave through the entire courtroom. He turned his back entirely on Bradley's previous narrative of a simple misunderstanding. The attorney pointed directly at Jordan. He formally accused my son of acting entirely alone. He explicitly claimed that Jordan had masterminded the entire fraudulent wire conspiracy, forged the medical documents independently, and completely deceived Bradley. He painted the ruthless billionaire as an innocent, unsuspecting victim of a rogue, highly ambitious employee who had gone to extreme criminal lengths to impress his wealthy father-in-law. Bradley was ruthlessly cutting his losses, utilizing his vast legal power to throw Jordan directly into the federal incinerator. Jordan physically recoiled, his face draining of all color as he realized his father-in-law was actively framing him for the entire scope of the federal indictment. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Jordan sat frozen at the defense table. He had to make an immediate life-altering decision. He must choose whether to maintain his silence and absorb decades in federal prison to protect the man who was currently destroying him, or finally step up to the witness stand and tell the absolute truth. The suffocating tension inside the federal courtroom reached an absolute undeniable breaking point as Bradley's lead attorney formally pointed his index finger directly at my son. The audacious, desperate accusation hung heavily in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned environment. Bradley was attempting to completely sever his remaining liabilities, casually throwing Jordan into the path of a devastating, inescapable federal indictment to shield his own billionaire status from the impending fallout. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, maintaining my posture with rigid military discipline, keeping my eyes locked securely on the defense table. I watched the exact moment my son's final pathetic illusion shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Jordan stared at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes, fully realizing that the powerful, untouchable father-in-law he had worshipped, the man he had eagerly sold his soul to impress, viewed him as entirely expendable collateral. Jordan's own court-appointed public defender leaned in close, whispering frantically, desperately advising him to maintain his silence and invoke his constitutional protections against self-incrimination. Jordan did not listen to the frantic, sweating lawyer. He slowly pushed his heavy wooden chair back. The harsh, grating sound of the wooden legs dragging against the polished floorboards echoed loudly through the completely silent room. He stood up. His bright orange standard-issue prison uniform hung loosely over his shrinking, thoroughly defeated frame. He was completely devoid of the arrogant, tailored corporate armor he used to wear while parading through my home. He looked physically hollowed out, his shoulders slumped heavily forward, his hands trembling violently at his sides. He addressed the bench, his voice cracking, and requested formal permission to take the witness stand. The presiding federal judge granted the request with a solemn, heavy nod, instructing the bailiff to escort the prisoner across the room. As Jordan walked slowly across the wide well of the courtroom, his heavy institutional shoes scuffing the floor, he lifted his head and looked directly at me for the first time in several agonizing months. I did not break eye contact. I offered absolutely no comforting smile, no subtle nod of paternal reassurance, and projected absolutely no lingering anger. I simply watched him with the cold, detached assessment of a man evaluating the final, inevitable results of a catastrophic structural failure. He took his seat in the elevated wooden witness box, placing his trembling right hand flat on the holy text, and swore a binding, unalterable oath to tell the absolute truth under penalty of severe perjury. The lead federal prosecutor stepped smoothly forward, entirely bypassing any standard time-consuming introductory questions. She asked him directly if he had orchestrated the fraudulent property transfer and the illegal psychiatric commitment entirely on his own, exactly as Bradley's elite defense team had just aggressively claimed. Jordan tightly gripped the polished edges of the wooden rail. He took a deep, ragged breath and completely broke down on the stand. It was not a calculated theatrical display of legal remorse engineered by a defense attorney. It was the genuine visceral collapse of a man whose entire fabricated fraudulent reality had been systematically and ruthlessly incinerated. Heavy tears streamed rapidly down his pale, exhausted face as he leaned forward and spoke directly into the sensitive microphone. He explicitly and categorically denied acting alone. He stated for the official federal record that every single illegal action he took, every forged signature, and every drugged cup of tea was directly ordered, funded, and meticulously orchestrated by his father-in-law Bradley. Under the sharp, methodical, and unrelenting questioning of the federal prosecutor, Jordan began to systematically dismantle Bradley's entire criminal empire from the inside out. He provided the captivated jury with a meticulous, horrifyingly detailed account of the vast extortion plot. He explained exactly how Bradley had initially lured him into the syndicate with the promise of immense corporate power, only to deliberately trap him in a vicious, inescapable cycle of illegal off-the-books shadow loans. He explicitly detailed how Bradley had aggressively demanded the Lake Superior farms as mandatory collateral, viewing the pristine generational land as the ultimate highly lucrative crown jewel for his aggressive commercial development portfolio. Jordan did not attempt to spare himself from the devastating narrative. He confessed to his direct, unforgivable role in the severe psychological warfare waged against me inside my own home. He testified about the specific highly regulated chemical sedatives he had actively dissolved into my evening tea, confirming the exact medical dosage and the illegal supplier Bradley had utilized. He told the horrified silent jury about the fake property appraiser Bradley had dispatched to the suburban house, a highly paid corporate fixer, specifically tasked with casing the valuable property while I was chemically incapacitated on the couch. Jordan laid out the exact, undeniable timeline of the fraudulent property deeds, explicitly confirming that Bradley's elite corporate attorneys had actively drafted the forged power of attorney documents and instructed Jordan on exactly how to execute the fraudulent signatures without triggering bank security flags. The federal prosecutor then pivoted sharply to the most severe violent charge on the sprawling federal docket. She asked Jordan to detail the kidnapping and false imprisonment. Jordan wept openly, his voice echoing through the speakers as he described the counterfeit medical orderlies who had dragged me out of my home. He testified that Bradley had personally funded the corrupt psychiatric facility, utilizing his massive, untraceable wealth to purchase the absolute silence of the facility director and secure my illegal, indefinite detention. He confessed that the ultimate, terrifying goal was to keep me locked away in chemical isolation until the property transfers were completely finalized and my assets were permanently absorbed into Bradley's complex network of offshore holding companies. Bradley sat completely frozen at the defense table, his face draining of blood. His highly paid attorneys scrambled frantically, violently objecting to the devastating testimony, but the federal judge swiftly and aggressively overruled every single desperate attempt to silence my son. The undeniable cascading weight of Jordan's detailed confession perfectly aligned with every single piece of physical evidence, chemical soil analysis, and digital audio recording. Evelyn and I had meticulously submitted to the court. The defense's desperate, fabricated narrative of an isolated rogue employee was completely and utterly annihilated in front of the jury. The prosecutor paused deliberately, letting the devastating gravity of the federal crimes settle heavily over the silent jury box. She looked at Jordan with chilling professional detachment and asked the final underlying question. She asked him why he would ever willingly agree to participate in such a monstrous, calculated betrayal against a father who had raised him with absolute devotion, grueling manual labor, and unwavering support. Jordan lowered his head, his voice dropping to a harsh, broken whisper that barely registered on the microphone. He confessed his deepest, most profound insecurities to the open courtroom. He admitted that he had always felt entirely inadequate standing in my shadow. He told the jury about my life as a dedicated military mechanic, describing a father who lived with rigid, uncompromising discipline and absolute, unshakable honor. He explicitly stated that he knew he could never measure up to a man who built his life with his own two calloused hands and never once compromised his integrity for an easy, corrupt payout. Jordan confessed that he felt inherently weak, a profound internal failure masked only by blind, reckless ambition. He testified that he had desperately chased Bradley's toxic, predatory wealth and eagerly sought Megan's conditional, manipulative approval to construct a massive, glittering facade of success. He wanted to buy the respect and power he was completely incapable of earning through honest, grueling labor. He truly believed that by aligning himself with a ruthless billionaire, he could finally step out of my shadow and project an impenetrable illusion of supreme success. He traded his soul, his loyal father, and his entire moral foundation simply to compensate for his own pathetic, deep-seated internal weakness. The courtroom remained in a state of absolute breathless silence as Jordan concluded his devastating testimony. He had willingly provided the federal government with the ultimate undeniable smoking gun. His detailed, emotional confession securely locked Bradley into a guaranteed, inescapable federal conviction. The billionaire's sprawling, predatory empire was officially reduced to ashes, his freedom permanently revoked. However, Jordan's truthful testimony also served as a complete, legally binding self-incrimination. He had systematically detailed his own direct, undeniable participation in severe federal crimes. He looked up at the federal judge, his face completely devoid of any remaining hope, and formally entered a guilty plea on all counts, officially accepting his convictions for federal wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and severe elder abuse. He offered absolutely no excuses and requested zero leniency from the court. He simply accepted his absolute self-inflicted ruin. The federal judge leaned heavily forward, his expression grave, disgusted, and entirely unyielding. He adjusted his heavy wooden gavel, bringing the chaotic murmurs of the gallery to an immediate, sharp halt. He ordered Bradley to stand and face the bench. He ordered Jordan to remain standing in the wooden witness box. The trial phase was officially concluded. The judge opened his thick leather binding and prepared to deliver the final devastating sentences that would permanently lock both men away in maximum security federal penitentiaries for decades to come. I remained seated in the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, completely ready to witness the final absolute execution of justice. The heavy silence in the federal courtroom was absolute. The presiding judge closed his thick leather binding with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed off the polished mahogany walls. He looked down from the elevated bench, his severe gaze sweeping across the crowded room before locking directly onto me. He formally addressed the gallery, stating that before the court delivered the final irrevocable sentencing for the federal crimes committed, the primary victim was legally entitled to address the court. He asked if I wished to make a formal victim impact statement. I did not hesitate. I stood up from the hard wooden bench, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared with the ingrained discipline of decades of military service. I walked deliberately down the center aisle, feeling the intense, unbroken focus of every single prosecutor, defense attorney, and spectator in the room. I stepped up to the wooden podium facing the judge, resting my calloused hands firmly on the edges of the stand. I took a slow, deep breath, centering my mind and entirely banishing any lingering traces of adrenaline. I turned my head and looked directly at the primary defense table. Bradley sat slumped in his expensive tailored suit, the arrogant, untouchable billionaire facade completely shattered. He looked pathetic, stripped of his offshore accounts and his elite corporate fixers. I looked at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. I spoke directly into the sensitive microphone, my voice resonating with sharp, unyielding clarity. I told the judge that the man sitting at the defense table was a predator who viewed human lives entirely as disposable currency. I detailed how Bradley had utilized his extreme wealth to systematically crush vulnerable individuals, weaponizing the legal system to steal generational lands and destroy honest families. I explained that his sprawling criminal empire was built exclusively on a foundation of extreme arrogance and profound moral corruption. He had orchestrated my kidnapping, funded a counterfeit psychiatric ward, and attempted to permanently silence a federal whistleblower without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. I looked back up at the judge and explicitly requested that the court apply the absolute, unyielding weight of the federal law. I demanded that Bradley be stripped of his remaining assets, permanently removed from society, and locked inside a maximum security penitentiary for the remainder of his natural life. I stated that a man who actively destroys the foundation of justice deserves no mercy from the court. I paused, letting the heavy, devastating weight of my words settle over the silent courtroom. Then I slowly shifted my gaze to the adjacent table. Jordan sat in his bright orange prison uniform, his head bowed heavily, his hands shackled securely to his waist. Looking at my son, a profound, heavy realization washed over me. For my entire adult life, I had worked as a military and civilian mechanic. I had spent countless grueling hours leaning over shattered chassis, diagnosing catastrophic engine failures and replacing damaged components. I knew exactly how to salvage broken machinery. I knew how to clean away surface rust, lubricate grinding gears, and restore a failing engine to perfect working order. However, decades of mechanical experience had also taught me a harsh, unforgiving truth. When the corrosive rust penetrated too deeply into the core structural integrity of an engine block surface, repairs were completely useless. You could not simply patch a fundamentally corrupted foundation. The entire machine had to be ruthlessly torn down, stripped completely bare to its lowest base components, and meticulously rebuilt from the ground up. I turned my attention back to the presiding judge, my voice entirely devoid of vengeance or malice. I spoke with the calm, absolute certainty of a father executing his final, most difficult duty. I told the court that the young man sitting at the defense table had willfully allowed the corrosive rust of corporate greed to completely destroy his moral compass. Jordan had actively chosen to betray his family, drug his own father, and forge federal documents simply to chase an illusion of unearned wealth. He had traded his honor for the toxic approval of a billionaire criminal. I explicitly stated that I did not ask the court for leniency regarding my son. I asked the judge to deliver a harsh, uncompromising prison sentence. I clarified that my request was not born from a desire for revenge, but from a strict, necessary requirement for justice. I told the jury that a man who commits such profound, calculated betrayals must be forced to pay his debts to society in full. Prison was the only remaining environment where Jordan could be entirely stripped of his toxic ambitions and his fabricated corporate identity. A severe sentence was the only crucible hot enough to burn away his deep-seated insecurities. I stated that if my son was ever going to find true, lasting redemption, he had to be torn down to his absolute foundation and forced to rebuild himself from the ground up. The federal judge listened to my statement with grave, solemn attention. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the profound, uncompromising truth of my words. I stepped away from the wooden podium and walked with measured precision back to my seat in the front row of the gallery. Evelyn offered a brief, respectful nod as I sat down beside her. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and called the defendants to stand and face the court. The atmosphere in the massive room grew incredibly dense, suffocating under the impending weight of the federal sentences. The judge addressed Bradley first, his voice echoing with supreme, unquestionable authority. He systematically reprimanded the billionaire for his breathtaking arrogance and his vast destructive criminal conspiracy. The judge explicitly declared that extreme wealth would no longer shield him from accountability. He brought the heavy gavel down with a deafening crack, officially sentencing Bradley to a mandatory 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely denying any possibility of early parole. Bradley's knees buckled slightly, two armed federal marshals immediately stepping forward to physically support his dead weight. The judge then turned his severe gaze toward Jordan. He acknowledged my victim impact statement, noting the tragic, calculated nature of the betrayal. He highlighted Jordan's ultimate decision to confess and testify, but firmly reiterated that cooperation did not erase the severe magnitude of the elder abuse and wire fraud. The judge raised his gavel a final time. He officially sentenced Jordan to 8 years in a federal correctional facility. The sharp crack of the wooden mallet echoed through the silent room, officially closing the sprawling legal chapter of the conspiracy. Armed federal bailiffs immediately moved in, grabbing the defendants by their upper arms and aggressively steering them toward the heavy steel doors leading to the holding cells. As they marched the prisoners away, Jordan abruptly stopped and turned his head. He looked directly at me across the wide expanse of the courtroom. His eyes were red, overflowing with absolute regret and the crushing reality of his incoming incarceration. He looked at me, his shoulders trembling, and silently mouthed the words, "I am sorry." I did not smile and I did not wave. I simply looked at my son and delivered a single stoic nod. It was an acknowledgement of his apology and a quiet acceptance of the long, grueling road to redemption he was about to walk alone. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him, the metallic boom echoing with absolute finality. The media circus was already exploding outside the courthouse doors, reporters frantically broadcasting the total annihilation of Bradley's corporate empire. I stood up from the wooden bench, buttoning my tailored jacket. Evelyn walked silently by my side as we navigated the crowded hallways and pushed through the heavy exit doors into the sharp, freezing afternoon air. We bypassed the screaming journalists, stepping smoothly into the waiting warmth of her black town car. The engine rumbled to life, pulling away from the curb and leaving the legal battlefield behind. The war was officially over. I had systematically hunted down the men who tried to bury me, completely dismantled their offshore accounts, and successfully reclaimed my absolute freedom. However, as the car navigated the familiar suburban streets toward my property, a stark, sobering reality settled heavily over my thoughts. I had won the war and protected my legacy, but the cost was absolute. The town car pulled into the quiet driveway. I stepped out into the freezing wind, looking up at the sprawling, beautiful house I had built with my own hands. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside. The foyer was perfectly clean, silent, and entirely devoid of life. I was legally vindicated, financially secure, and completely free, but I now had to face the profound, agonizing emptiness of a house that no longer held a family. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the profound, ringing silence of the foyer. The suburban house was massive, impeccably designed, and utterly vacant. It was no longer a home. It was a sprawling, sterile museum dedicated to a family dynamic that had completely ceased to exist. I walked slowly through the spacious living room, my boots echoing sharply against the pristine hardwood floors. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to break down, nor did I feel the paralyzing grip of nostalgic grief. My mind was operating with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a man surveying a heavily damaged vehicle that was officially designated as beyond repair. The foundation was irredeemably cracked. It was time to systematically salvage the functional components and permanently abandon the rusted chassis. I moved deliberately through the empty rooms, executing my final extraction with strict military precision. I carried a single heavy canvas duffel bag. I completely ignored the expensive superficial trappings of suburban success. I left the high-end electronics, the premium leather furniture, and the imported decorative art exactly where they sat. I proceeded directly to the master bedroom and carefully packed my late wife's framed photographs, wrapping the delicate glass securely in soft cotton. I retrieved the heavy velvet cases containing my military service medals, tracing the embossed bronze with my thumb before burying them deep inside the canvas bag. Finally, I walked into the attached garage. I bypassed the standard suburban clutter and went straight for my heavy steel tool chests. I packed my grease-stained socket sets, the heavy iron wrenches, and the specialized diagnostic meters I had utilized for over 4 decades. I was stripping my entire existence down to its absolute uncompromising foundational elements. The house was officially listed for sale the very next morning. I explicitly bypassed the aggressive, high-profile corporate real estate brokers who catered to Bradley's specific demographic of predatory wealth. Instead, I instructed an independent working-class agent to find a young, genuinely hardworking family. Within a week, the transaction was finalized. I sat in a modest, brightly lit closing office and officially signed the property deed over to a young couple. The husband had thick, heavily calloused hands from working in industrial construction, and his wife projected a quiet, resilient strength. They looked at the property documents with sheer, unadulterated gratitude. I handed them the heavy brass keys, experiencing a profound, quiet satisfaction. The house would finally serve its intended structural purpose. It would shelter a family that actually understood the fundamental value of honest, grueling labor. Before departing the city limits, I scheduled one final, strictly professional meeting with Evelyn. We met in the quiet, highly secure conference room of her elite downtown law firm. I did not offer her a standard, superficial expression of gratitude. I placed a thick, sealed premium envelope directly onto the polished mahogany table and slid it across the smooth surface. It contained a massive, heavily certified bonus check drawn from my recently unfrozen corporate accounts. It was an exact, highly calculated reflection of her flawless legal execution. Evelyn opened the envelope, verifying the immense sum with a brief professional nod. She had operated as the perfect, ruthless extension of my tactical strategy, dismantling a billionaire's heavily fortified empire with surgical legal precision. We stood up, exchanged a final firm handshake, and parted ways with the deep, unspoken mutual respect of 2 veteran soldiers walking away from a perfectly executed battlefield operation. I drove my heavy, reliable truck out of the sprawling, polluted city, merging onto the northbound interstate. The dense gray concrete skyline rapidly dissolved in the rearview mirror, gradually replaced by the towering ancient pines of the deep Michigan wilderness. I drove for 6 hours, letting the steady, vibrating hum of the engine anchor my thoughts. The further I traveled into the isolated northern territory, the lighter the crushing psychological weight of the past several months became. I finally turned off the paved highway, navigating a rough, heavily rutted gravel road that wound deep into the thick, freezing forest. At the very end of the treacherous path, surrounded by towering, snow-dusted timber, stood the log house on Lake Superior. I cut the engine and stepped out into the biting, razor-sharp northern air. The structure was undeniably rustic, built from massive interlocking logs that had weathered decades of brutal winter storms without shifting a single millimeter. It was visually stark, exceptionally sturdy, and profoundly beautiful. I walked the perimeter of the property, my boots crunching heavily through the frozen underbrush. Looking out over the sprawling, untouched acreage, the absolute magnitude of my brother Edgar's ultimate gift finally crystallized in my mind. For years, I believed Edgar had simply left me a highly valuable tract of isolated timber. I was completely wrong. Edgar did not just leave me land. He had meticulously engineered an impenetrable fortress. He had legally secured a vast, isolated sanctuary where the toxic, corrosive corruption of the city could never possibly reach me. He had provided the exact tactical fallback position I needed to survive my own son's ultimate betrayal. I walked up the heavy wooden steps and stepped onto the expansive rear deck. The vast, freezing expanse of Lake Superior stretched out endlessly before me, the dark, turbulent water crashing violently against the jagged shoreline. The sheer, terrifying power of the natural landscape was entirely humbling. I set my heavy canvas duffel bag down on the weathered floorboards and immediately unpacked my steel tools. I noticed a thick wooden railing on the edge of the porch that had violently splintered under the weight of a recent winter storm. I did not ignore the structural flaw. I pulled a heavy iron hammer and a box of galvanized nails from my kit. I measured the damaged timber, aligned the heavy joints, and began the physical repair. The rhythmic, echoing strike of heavy metal against solid wood reverberated through the freezing air. The grueling, repetitive physical labor instantly grounded my mind, bringing a deep, profound peace to my soul that I had not experienced since my wife passed away. As the sun began its slow, vibrant descent beneath the dark horizon, casting brilliant streaks of crimson and gold across the violent surface of the lake, I paused my work and surveyed the final layout of the board. The sprawling acreage surrounding me was permanently shielded by an unassailable federal trust completely locked away from any future corporate predation. Hundreds of miles away, Bradley was currently rotting inside a sterile, heavily monitored maximum security cell, entirely stripped of his invisible financial armor and facing the absolute terror of a 20-year sentence. Megan had been brutally expelled from her fabricated reality. She was currently standing behind a generic cash register at a massive retail outlet, wearing a cheap synthetic uniform and earning a minimum wage, permanently stripped of the unearned luxury she had viciously attempted to steal from a grieving father. And Jordan, the son I had promised to protect, was currently locked behind a heavy steel door in a federal correctional facility. He was entirely isolated from his toxic ambitions, facing an agonizing 8-year sentence. It was a harsh, grueling reality, but it was absolutely necessary. He was finally enduring the mandatory, unforgiving process of learning absolute accountability. The trap I had engineered was entirely flawless. I did not scream, I did not beg for basic human respect, and I did not resort to crude, unpredictable physical violence. I simply observed the enemy, calculated their structural weaknesses, and utilized their own blinding, insatiable greed to orchestrate their precise, inescapable downfall. The silent adjustment was absolute. I stood on the sturdy wooden deck, taking a deep restorative breath of the freezing, crisp northern air. I reached for my battered steel thermos, poured a steaming cup of strong black coffee, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I was finally truly free. If you found this story compelling and want to experience more immersive narratives about justice and resilience, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for future updates.